the sacred mountain of Kogayonon, the sacred mountain where monks disappeared. It still looms in the mists of modern Romania, a place wrapped in silence and geological mystery. We are told by the ancient geographer Strabo that this was the holy mountain of the Dacians, the dwelling place of their god-prophet Zelmoxis. It was here, in a deep cavern, that he established his priesthood, a lineage of monks who would advise kings and interpret the will of the heavens. They would enter the mountain's embrace, and sometimes they would simply vanish, believed to have ascended to join their god, leaving the mortal world behind. The mountain, a silent witness, holds these secrets tightly, a limestone fortress of faith that defined a people. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where and when you're listening from tonight. And so our story begins not with the clash of steel or the founding of cities, but with the quiet echo of devotion in a place that history has almost, but not entirely, forgotten. Before there was an empire, before there was a king named Decebalus, or a Roman emperor named Trajan, there was the land itself, a vast, rugged, and densely forested territory cradled by the Carpathian Mountains and watered by the mighty Danube River. This was Dacia, and at the heart of Dacia, at least in a spiritual sense, was this mountain Kogayonon. Its exact location is now a profound historiographical mystery, a puzzle debated by scholars for centuries. Some point to the Bucegi Mountains, where strange rock formations like the Sphinx and Babele seem to carry an echo of ancient worship. Others argue for Godianu, or perhaps Tseahlau Massif, each peak claiming a piece of the legend. The uncertainty itself is part of the allure, suggesting that Kogayonon was perhaps less a single, fixed geographical point, and more a concept, a sacred mountain that could exist wherever the divine presence was felt most strongly. The ancient sources, primarily Strabo writing in the time of Augustus, describe Kogayonon as both a place of refuge and a center of immense power. It was here that Zelmoxis, the figure at the center of Dacian spirituality, was said to have retreated. The stories surrounding him are themselves layered in myth, part philosophy, part shamanism. Some ancient Greeks, like Herodotus, tried to rationalize him, suggesting he was a mortal man, a student of the philosopher Pythagoras, who traveled north and brought esoteric knowledge of immortality to the Getae, the name the Greeks often used for the people we now call Dacians. According to this version, Zelmoxis feigned his own death, hiding in an underground chamber for 3 years before re-emerging, thereby proving his resurrection and his doctrine of the immortal soul. This story, while fascinating, feels like a very Greek attempt to fit a complex foreign belief system into a familiar Hellenic box. The Dacian belief, it seems, was far more primal and profound. Zelmoxis was not merely a teacher. He was a god, or at the very least, a divine intermediary, and Kogayonon was his temple, his fortress, and his throne. The high priest of Zelmoxis, who dwelled in the mountain's cave, was the most powerful man in the kingdom besides the king himself. In fact, the king was often seen as subservient to the priest's spiritual authority. This priest, whose name was also passed down through generations, lived a life of asceticism, withdrawn from the world, eating no meat and seeing almost no one, save for the king. He was the voice of the god, the interpreter of omens in the sky, and the moral anchor of the entire Dacian society. The monks who served under him, those ascetics who vanished, were perhaps not vanishing at all, but simply retiring so deeply into the mountain's cave system, into a life of meditation and isolation, that they were considered, for all intents and purposes, dead to the outside world. They had begun their journey to Zalmoxis before their bodies had even failed. Imagine, then, the atmosphere of this place. The lower slopes of the Carpathians, covered in dense primeval forests of oak, beech, and fir, teeming with wolves and bears, animals that would become central to Dacian warrior symbolism. The air is cool, thin, and filled with the sound of wind moving through high pines. As one ascends, the trees give way to alpine meadows and then to sheer gray limestone cliffs. Somewhere here, hidden from casual view, is the entrance to the cave. It is not a grand, sculpted entrance like an Egyptian tomb, but likely a simple fissure in the rock, known only to the initiated. Inside, the darkness is absolute, broken only by the flicker of a tallow lamp. The air is cold and still. This is where the spiritual lifeblood of a nation is centered. When Dacian warriors went to war, they did so with a fearlessness that stunned their enemies, a bravado born from the belief, instilled by the man in this cave, that death was not an end, but a departure, a simple journey to a happier place, to meet Zalmoxis. This concept of Kogaionon, the holy mountain, sets the stage for everything that follows. The Dacians were not a scattered collection of disorganized barbarians, as Roman propaganda would later paint them. They were a people unified by a powerful and sophisticated spiritual framework, a warrior ethos, and a deep, almost mystical connection to their rugged homeland. Their politics, their society, and their eventual resistance to the greatest empire the world had ever known were all rooted in the philosophies whispered from this sacred, secret place. The mountain provided a focal point for their identity. While kings might rise and fall, and tribes might feud, the mountain and its god were constant, an eternal anchor in a turbulent world. The power of Kogaionon was the power of belief itself, a force that could unite tribes, legitimize kings, and inspire a whole people to fight and die with a fervor that would eventually demand the full, undivided attention of Rome. Our journey into their history, therefore, starts here, in the quiet, mysterious heart of their faith, long before the first Roman legionary ever crossed the Danube. These people of the Holy Mountain did not spring from the earth fully formed, but were themselves a powerful current in a much larger river of humanity. Before we can speak of Dacia as a kingdom, we must first look to their ancestors, the broad and formidable family of tribes known as the Thracians. The ancient world was awash with their peoples. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, famously remarked that the Thracians were the most numerous people in the world after the Indians, and he mused that if they were ever united under a single ruler, they would be invincible and by far the most powerful nation on earth. This observation, though perhaps a slight exaggeration, captures the scale of their presence. They were not a niche tribe, but a vast ethno-linguistic group, a mosaic of clans and kingdoms that stretched from the Aegean Sea in the south to the vast plains beyond the Danube in the north, from the Black Sea coast in the east, deep into the Balkan interior. They were a people of renowned horsemen, fierce warriors, skilled metal workers, and deep, ecstatic religious traditions. The people we have come to call the Dacians were quite simply the northernmost branch of this great Thracian family. The Greeks, who first encountered them through their colonies on the Black Sea coast, like Histria and Tomis, knew them as the Getae. It was this name, the Getae, that dominated the early histories, the people who lived in the flatlands between the Balkans and the Danube, and across the river into what is now Wallachia. The Romans, encountering them much later as they pushed north from Macedonia and Illyria, came to know the tribes living further west in the mountainous heartland of the Carpathians and the plains of Transylvania as the Daci or Dacians. This has left a small but persistent historiographical puzzle. Were the Getae and the Dacians one and the same people, or two closely related but distinct groups? The Roman geographer Strabo, writing around the time of Christ, offered a tidy explanation, stating that the Getaes were those who lived toward the Black Sea, while the Dacians lived in the opposite direction, toward the west and the sources of the Danube. He also noted quite clearly that the Dacians speak the same language as the Getae. For our purposes, as we drift back into the sleepy haze of the early Iron Age, it is best to see them as a single people, differentiated perhaps by regional geography and minor tribal customs, but sharing a common language, a common spiritual framework, and a common origin. They were all part of that great Thracian tapestry. Their language, now lost to time, was a Paleo-Balkan tongue, a branch of the Indo-European family tree, related to the tongues of their southern Thracian cousins, but distinct from the Greek, Celtic, and Scythian languages spoken by their neighbors. We catch only fleeting glimpses of it now, reserved in the names of their kings, Burebista, Decebalus, their towns, which often ended in the suffix "dava," meaning settlement or town, and in the cryptic inscriptions on artifacts that scholars still struggle to decipher. Their religion, too, was a northern variant of Thracian beliefs, centered on the sky god Zalmoxis, whose promise of immortality, as we saw on Kogaionon, gave the Getae Dacians a particular reputation for fearlessness in the face of death. This shared Thracian root is vital to understanding who they were. They were not isolated barbarians in a dark forest. They were participants in a wide-ranging and ancient cultural exchange that defined the Bronze and Iron Ages of Eastern Europe. They lived at a continental crossroads. To their east, across the plains and the Black Sea, were the nomadic Scythians, masters of the horse and the composite bow, whose artistic animal style would profoundly influence Dacian metalwork, lending its swirling stylized griffins and stags to their helmets and silverwork. To their west, the Celtic tribes, particularly the Boii and Taurishi, would eventually migrate and settle, bringing new techniques in ironworking and new social structures. And to the south, the Greeks provided a constant market for Dacian goods, grain, honey, timber, and crucially, slaves, in exchange for wine, fine pottery, and the silver coinage that the Dacians would eventually copy to mint their own. Archaeology paints a picture of this early Getic society. Excavations have revealed settlements from as early as the 6th century BC, showing simple, rectangular, semi-subterranean houses, their floors dug into the earth for warmth. They were farmers primarily, growing wheat and barley, and raising cattle and sheep. But they were also miners and smiths, The Carpathian Mountains were rich in ores, and these northern Thracians learned to extract and work iron for their distinctive weapons, like the Sika, a curved sickle-like dagger that would become a feared and iconic weapon, later even adopted by Roman gladiators. Their burial rites also marked them. While southern Thracians built elaborate stone tombs filled with golden treasures, the Getae practiced a range of rituals, sometimes cremation, sometimes inhumation, often burying their warrior aristocracy under large earthen mounds called tumuli. These tombs, when unearthed, reveal a society already stratified, where chieftains were laid to rest with their weapons, their armor, and their sacrificed horses, ready to ride into the afterlife promised by Zalmoxis. This, then, was the foundation, a hardy, numerous, and deeply spiritual Thracian people, established for centuries in the lands of the Danube and the Carpathians, shaped by their sacred mountains and the powerful cultures that pressed in from every side. From this potent, swirling proto-culture, a more defined and powerful identity was about to emerge. From this widespread and ancient Thracian foundation, a new, more distinct pattern began to imprint itself upon the land, a visible marker of a society organizing itself in a more complex and permanent way. This was the Arabs of the Davai, the rise of the fortified settlements that would come to define the Dacian homeland. The word itself, Dava, is one of an achingly small handful of Dacian words that have survived the passage of time, preserved in the writings of ancient geographers like Ptolemy, who listed the names of these towns: Pyraboridava, Zargidava, Tamasidava, Pelandava. The suffix dava simply meant town or settlement, but in the context of the Iron Age, it signified something far more profound than the simple, undefended hamlets of their ancestors. It represented the crystallization of tribal power, the construction of centers that were simultaneously economic hubs, political seats, and formidable strongholds. These were the first true cities of Dacia, etched into the hills and river terraces of the Carpathian landscape. This transition was not sudden, but a slow, creeping evolution driven by necessity and opportunity. As the Dacian tribes grew in population and wealth, so too did the need to protect that wealth. The lands of the Danube were a corridor for migration and invasion. The Scythians still roamed the plains to the east, and waves of Celtic peoples, fierce and technologically advanced, were pressing in from the west. The old, open villages were dangerously vulnerable. In response, Dacian society began to draw inward and upward, choosing high ground, steep hills, prominent bluffs overlooking rivers, or naturally defensible plateaus as the sites for their new centers. These locations were not chosen for agricultural convenience, as the old villages had been, but for strategic command. They were places from which a chieftain could watch over his territory, control the movement of traders along a river valley, and, most importantly, gather his people in times of war. Archaeological excavations at the sites of these davates reveal the immense labor and sophisticated planning that went into their construction. The defenses were, at first, relatively simple. Deep ditches were dug, and the excavated earth was piled high to create massive ramparts. These earthen walls were then crowned with sharp wooden palisades, a dense forest of sharpened stakes that would have presented a formidable obstacle to any attacker. Inside these defenses, the settlement was often densely packed. The dwellings were still the characteristic rectangular, semi-subterranean houses of their ancestors, dug partially into the ground for stability and insulation, their timber frames supporting walls of wattle and daub and heavy thatched roofs. But clustered among them, excavators find the clear imprints of specialized workshops. The Davai were becoming centers of industry. Here, blacksmiths, their faces lit by the glow of the forge, hammered out the iconic Sika blades, the long curved falx war scythes, and the tools needed for farming and building. Potters, using faster wheels, produced a distinctive style of dark, polished pottery, often decorated with stamped or burnished geometric patterns, a craft that moved beyond simple utility toward a recognized regional aesthetic. We find evidence of trade on a new scale: imported Greek amphorae, fragments of wine jars from the south, speak of a thirst among the new Dacian aristocracy for the luxuries of the Mediterranean world. In return, the Davai served as collection points for the resources of the hinterland, the grain, the hides, the honey, and the slaves captured in tribal warfare, funneling them down the rivers to the Greek merchants waiting on the Black Sea coast. These settlements were also the crucibles of a more stratified society. The simple farmer-warrior ethos was giving way to a more complex hierarchy. At the heart of the Dava lived a powerful tribal chieftain or king, his dwelling likely larger and more prominent than the others, his wealth demonstrated by his possession of imported goods and his retinue of elite warriors. These were the men who commanded the loyalty of the surrounding clans, who marshaled the labor to build the great ramparts, and who led the raids against their neighbors. Their power was still personal, built on charisma, bravery in battle, and the perceived favor of the gods, but it was now being cemented in earth, timber, and stone. The Dava was the physical expression of their authority. One of the most significant and extensively studied of these early Davai is Popesht, located on a terrace of the Argeș River in southern Romania. This settlement, flourishing centuries before the great kings, provides a perfect window into this formative period. Archaeologists unearthed not just the dense collection of dwellings and workshops, but also what appears to be a sacred precinct, a special area set aside for religious rituals, perhaps containing wooden idols or altars that have long since turned to dust. They also found evidence of intense metallurgical activity, including molds for casting bronze and iron artifacts, confirming the site's role as a technological center. Most tellingly, they found a vast quantity of imported Greek pottery, far more than its smaller contemporary villages, proving that Popesht was a major node in the trade network linking the Carpathian interior with the Aegean. These Davai were the scattered, sturdy seeds from which the Dacian kingdom would eventually grow. They were not yet a unified nation. Each Dava was the center of its own small world, a tribal microstate, often in competition or outright conflict with its neighbors. But they established a pattern. They created a network of strong points, a shared architectural and social language across the region. They forged the warrior aristocracy that would one day demand a king to lead them all, and they turned the Dacian homeland from a sparsely populated forest into a landscape of defended, watchful communities, a land where the smoke rising from the forges of the Davas signaled the awakening of a new and formidable power. The shadows of these first ramparts were stretching long, and they were pointing toward a future that would soon bring them into contact and conflict with the wider world. The men who lived within the earthen ramparts of the Davos were not merely cowering behind their palisades, they were watching and they were waiting. The society taking shape in these fortified towns was at its very core a warrior society, one that defined itself by its martial prowess, its capacity for ferocious defense, and its deep, almost totemic connection to the wild heart of its homeland. This was a world divided into two clear classes, a distinction visible even to the Romans who would later write about them. There were the commati, the long-haired ones, the common folk, the farmers and artisans who formed the main body of any army, their unshorn hair a mark of their free status. And then there were the terabastes, or pileati as the Romans called them, the cap-wearers, the aristocracy who wore a distinctive felt or wool cap as a sign of their high birth. It was this noble class, the terabastes, who lived in the most protected areas of the Deve, who owned the largest herds, and who honed the art of war into a way of life, passing down weapons and warrior codes from father to son. But what truly united these classes, what gave them a terrifying and unique identity on the battlefields of the ancient world, was their central symbol, the Dacian Draco. This was not a simple flag or a carved eagle. It was a standard designed to inspire terror, a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Imagine a long pole held high by a warrior. At its top, a large, stylized wolf's head cast in bronze or perhaps even silver, its features snarled, its jaw hinged and wide open. Attached to this metal head was a long, hollow tail, not of metal, but of fabric, perhaps silk or fine wool, dyed in vibrant colors and cleverly stitched together in the shape of a serpent or a great windsock. When the standard-bearer stood still, it was an imposing, hybrid beast. But when he rode into the charge, or when the wind swept across the mountain ridge where the Dacian army was arrayed, the Draco came alive. The air, rushing through the wolf's open mouth and down the hollow tail, would create a high-pitched, terrifying sound, a mournful shriek, a wolf's howl blended with a serpent's hiss, a wail that seemed to come from the very throat of a monster. For a Roman legionary, accustomed to the predictable brass notes of his own army's cornu and tuba, the sound of 1,000 Dracos howling in the wind must have been an unnerving, almost supernatural experience. This symbol was the very soul of the Dacian army, and its choice was no accident. The wolf was the apex predator of the Carpathian forests, a creature of intelligence, ferocity, and crucially pack cohesion. The Dacians saw themselves in this animal. They were the wolves of the mountains, and their land was not to be trespassed upon. The ancient sources, trying to understand these people, even groped for an etymological link. Strabo, the geographer, noted a tradition that the Dacians originally called themselves Daoi, a name he connected to the Phrygian word daos, meaning wolf. Though modern linguistics debates this link, the power of the association is undeniable. They were, in their own minds, and in the minds of their enemies, the wolf people. This connection likely ran far deeper than a simple mascot. There are strong suggestions of a powerful warrior cult, a brotherhood of young men who sought to, in a ritual sense, become the wolf. This is a common thread in many warrior societies, a form of ecstatic, shamanistic practice where a fighter sheds his human fear and inhibition by taking on the spirit of a totemic animal. These Dacian wolf warriors would have been the berserkers of the Carpathians, a shock troop who led the charge, their minds altered by ritual, their howls blending with the shriek of the Draco they followed. This remains one of the great open mysteries of Dacian culture. We have no texts describing these rites, no high priest's manual. We have only the pervasive symbol of the wolf, the name itself, and the horrified accounts of their battlefield fury. We are left to imagine the ceremonies that must have taken place in the hidden groves and sacred precincts of the Dacia, the rhythmic drumming, the chanting, the ritual donning of a wolf pelt, a young warrior staring into a fire until his own identity blurred and the spirit of the Daos looked out through his eyes. This wolf spirit was then armed. The Dacian warrior carried weapons that were extensions of this ferocious ideal. We have already mentioned the Sika, the short, curved dagger, perfect for the close, brutal fighting of an ambush. But their most iconic and feared weapon was the false. This was a terrifying piece of iron, a long wooden handle, sometimes held with two hands, capped with a long, forward-curving sickle-like blade, sharpened on the inside edge. It was not a sword for fencing or a spear for formation fighting. It was a tool of pure aggression. It was designed to hook, to pull, and to cleave. A Roman legionary's scutum, or shield, was designed to deflect a straight sword thrust or a spear. It was not designed to be hooked and ripped away by a falx, exposing the man behind it. The Roman helmet, the galea, was designed to stop a downward blow. It was not designed to resist the concentrated, armor-piercing power of a two-handed falx strike, which could and did split helmets and sever limbs. The archaeological and visual record is clear on this. After Emperor Domitian's early, bruising encounters with the Dacians, Roman military armor began to change. Legionaries in Dacia were issued helmets reinforced with cruciform iron bars over the skull, a specific hurried modification to counter the horrifying effectiveness of the false. This stands as silent, metallic testimony to the terror this weapon inspired. This, then, was the society emerging from the Davos, a people of farmers and smiths certainly, but governed by a cap-wearing aristocracy and defined by a martial spirit that was deep, primal, and ritualized. They were the wolf people, following their howling standards into battle, wielding weapons so brutal they forced the Roman war machine itself to adapt. This formidable, untamed energy was, as yet, scattered among the mountains, loyal to dozens of different chieftains in dozens of different hill forts. But it was a shared culture, a shared spirit, and a shared potential. It was a snowpack on the high peaks, deep and heavy, waiting for a single thunderous crack to unleash the avalanche. This terrifying lupin spirit that animated the Dacian warrior, the howling energy that followed the Draco standard into the fray, was not born merely of a wild, predatory instinct. It was fueled, profoundly and directly, by the whispers that came from Kogaionon. It was a courage rooted not in a simple love of battle, but in a complex, all-encompassing theological conviction that fundamentally altered their relationship with mortality. The Dacians and their Getic ancestors were known throughout the ancient world for one staggering primary belief: they thought they did not die. Their central deity, Zalmoxis, the god who vanished into the sacred mountain, had not just offered them a vague concept of an afterlife, as so many other religions did. He had, in their minds, provided a direct, contractual promise of immortality, recasting the very definition of death as nothing more than a brief and necessary journey. The historian Herodotus, writing centuries before the Dacians would clash with the Roman Empire, was clearly baffled and fascinated by this. He called the Getae the most courageous of the Thracians and the most just, and he immediately explained why. They believe, he wrote, that they do not really die, but that when they depart this life, they go to Zalmoxis. This was not a philosophy reserved for the Terabostes aristocracy or the hidden priests in the cave. It was a core, societal truth, a fact of life as real as the turning of the seasons or the cold of the Carpathian winter. This belief, this certainty, drained the act of dying of its terror. A warrior facing a Roman line did not see an end. He saw a potential relocation. This conviction manifested in a ritual that Herodotus described with a kind of clinical awe, a ceremony that demonstrated the Getae's direct, almost conversational relationship with their god. Every 4 years, he tells us, they would choose one of their own by lot to send as a messenger to Zalmoxis to tell the god what the people currently needed. The method of this dispatch was a solemn and terrible expression of their faith. The chosen messenger would be held by his hands and feet by several men. Then, at a signal, he would be thrown upward, high into the air, to land upon the points of 3 sharpened spears held upright by others. If the man died immediately, pierced through, it was taken as a sign that the god was favorable, that the message had been received. If, however, the man agonized or survived the fall, he was reviled. He was called a wicked man, unworthy to carry their words to the divine, and another messenger would be chosen by lot to take his place. It is a chilling image, one that crosses the line from faith into a kind of brutal, ritualistic bureaucracy. But for the Getae, it was a necessary and logical act of communication. They were not murdering a man, they were sending a post. The origins of this powerful god were even in antiquity shrouded in a fascinating historiographical mystery, a debate that shows the ancient Greeks trying to make sense of this barbarian faith. Herodotus himself records 2 separate stories. The first, which he seems to favor, is that Zalmoxis was a native daemon, or divinity, a true god of the Getic people. But he also tells a second, more rationalizing story, one he says he heard from the Greeks living on the Black Sea coast. In this version, Zalmoxis was a mortal man, a Thracian who had been a slave in Samos to the great philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras. From his master, Zalmoxis learned of philosophy, astronomy, and the doctrines of the immortal soul. Upon gaining his freedom, he returned to his homeland a wealthy and educated man, and he began to teach his new wisdom to the chieftains and nobles, the Terabostes. He built a great hall, and he would host them, teaching them that neither they nor their descendants would ever die, but would instead go to a place where they would live forever in possession of all good things. Then, to prove his point, Zalmoxis had an underground chamber constructed. When it was complete, he vanished from the sight of his people, sealing himself inside this tomb-like room. The Getae, we are told, missed him terribly and mourned him as dead. He remained hidden for 3 full years. Then, in the 4th year, he re-emerged, as if resurrected from the grave. In doing so, he made his teachings credible. His resurrection was the ultimate proof, the event that turned his philosophy into a state religion. Herodotus, to his credit, ends this tale with a note of skepticism, writing, For my own part, I neither disbelieve nor entirely believe the story. I think that Zalmoxis lived long before Pythagoras. This Greek story, whether true or not, is incredibly revealing. It shows the Hellenic mind attempting to claim the wisdom of Zalmoxis, to file it neatly as an offshoot of their own Pythagorean philosophy. But the core belief feels far more ancient, more primal than a simple philosophical import. This god, whether he was a man who became a god or a god who walked as a man, was the center of Dacian life. His high priest, as we know from Strabo, dwelled in the sacred cave on Kogaionon and held immense power, advising the king on all matters of state, his words seen as direct transmissions from the divine. This gave Dacian society a theocratic bent, a fusion of royal and priestly power that created immense social cohesion. And Zalmoxis himself seems to have been a complex deity. Herodotus mentions that some Getae equated him with another god named Gebelesis, a god of the sky, of thunder and lightning. When the thunder rolled and the lightning split the sky, these Getae would shoot arrows upward, threatening the god not in anger, but in a ritualistic display of defiance, a way of showing their own immortal courage to the master of the storm. Zalmoxis, then, was perhaps a god of both the earth and the sky. The chthonic god, who lived in the mountain cave and promised resurrection from below, and the celestial god who ruled the heavens with thunder. He was the beginning and the end, the cave and the storm. This faith was the unseen bedrock of Dacia. It made their warriors fearless, it gave their priests power, and it unified their tribes with a shared, defiant certainty of their own eternity. This potent, scattered energy, a deep spiritual certainty of immortality, a network of defended Dave humming with industry, and a fierce, lupin warrior ethos, lay across the Carpathian landscape like a vast volatile thundercloud. It was a nation in potential, a people who shared a language, a god, and a way of life, but who lacked a single, unifying will. The Terabastes, the cap-wearing nobles, ruled their own territories from their own hill forts, their loyalties fractured, their energies spent as often against each other in raids and feuds as against outside threats. The wolf people were a pack, but a pack with no single alpha. For the Getae Dacians to become the invincible force Herodotus had imagined, they would need a leader of impossible ambition, military genius, and profound political cunning. And in the 1st century BC, precisely as the Roman Republic to their south was beginning to tear itself apart in the throes of its own civil wars, just such a figure emerged from the mists of the Transylvanian plateau. His name was Burebista. Of his early life, history tells us almost nothing. He simply appears in the record, fully formed and already in motion, around the year 82 BC. This silence is itself a form of historical mystery, leaving us to imagine the smaller, unrecorded battles, the backroom alliances, and the sheer force of personality that must have propelled him from being just one of many Terabastes to the undisputed king of all. Burebista's story is not one of gentle diplomacy. It was a brutal and methodical consolidation of power. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant general, and he unleashed the full, terrifying potential of the Dacian warrior against his own people. One by one, the other chieftains were faced with a simple, stark choice: bend the knee to Burebista, or see their Dave stormed and their warrior bands destroyed by a rival who wielded the falx with greater strategic purpose than any had ever seen. He was forging a nation in the fires of a Dacian civil war, uniting the tribes by first conquering them. But Burebista's genius was not purely military. He understood, in a way none of his predecessors had, that a kingdom held together by fear alone is brittle, that a true nation required a deeper, more profound adhesive. He understood the power that resided in the sacred quiet of Kogaionon. His greatest and most transformative act was not a battle, but an alliance. He sought out the high priest of Zalmoxis, a man named Dacian, or Dacaneos, as the Greek sources call him. This was the man who lived in the holy cave, the ascetic who interpreted the will of the god, the single most revered figure in the Dacian world. Burebista, the warrior king, made common cause with Dacian, the prophet priest. It was a fusion of temporal and spiritual authority that would change Dacia forever. Burebista offered the priest the military power to enforce his doctrines, and in return, Dacian gave the king what no amount of conquest could: divine right. Strabo, our primary source for this period, is explicit about this partnership. He describes Burebista as a formidable man who completely restored his people who had been worn down by frequent wars. And he did this, Strabo says, through practice, sobriety, and obedience to his commands, with the help of Dacian. The priest was seen as a man of great wisdom who had wandered as far as Egypt, bringing back knowledge of omens and astronomy. Together, they instituted a sweeping nationwide reform. The kingdom Burebista was building would not be the loose, raucous, wine-loving tribal confederation of the past. It would be a new, disciplined, and sober state. Dacian, with the full backing of Burebista's armies, was said to have convinced the Dacians to cut down their vines and live without wine. This was not a simple act of prohibition. It was a profound cultural statement. It was a move toward asceticism, a rejection of the chaotic, ecstatic revelries of their southern Thracian cousins, and a signal of a new, focused, and martial discipline. The wolf would now be sober, its senses sharp, its ferocity controlled and directed by the king. This partnership was the engine of unification. When Burebista demanded obedience, it was no longer just a warlord demanding tribute. It was the chosen king of Zalmoxis, backed by the god's own prophet, demanding righteous obedience. To defy Burebista was now to defy the heavens. This gave him the authority to reorganize the entire Dacian society. He established a system of command, a hierarchy of lesser chieftains who now answered to him. He likely standardized laws and customs, drawing on the religious codes of Dacian, and most importantly, he began to build. With the resources of the entire nation at his command, he transformed the central Dacian stronghold in the Orestier Mountains, the fortress that would become known as Sarmizegethusa Regia. It was no longer just another Dava. It was becoming a capital, a royal and sacred center for a newly unified kingdom. This singular leader had, in the span of just a few decades, achieved what Herodotus had only hypothesized. He had taken the scattered, feuding tribes of the Getae and the Dacians and hammered them into a single, massive, and formidable kingdom. The Tarabostates still wore their caps, and the Komati their long hair, but they no longer fought for a dozen different masters. They all looked to the new royal center, where the king's fortress rose near the priest's holy mountain. The howling of the Draco standard now heralded the advance of a single great army. Burebista, the unifier, had brought the pack together. Now, with this immense and disciplined power consolidated behind him, he began to look outward, beyond the Danube and the Carpathians, to the world that lay at his feet. With this new divine mandate cementing his rule, and with the spiritual and moral authority of Decanius guiding his people, Burebista's ambition was no longer contained by the mountain passes of the Carpathians. The kingdom, forged in internal conflict and tempered by a new, sober discipline, was now ready to be unleashed. The king did not pause to enjoy his consolidated power. He immediately turned the unified might of the Dacian tribes outward, beginning a series of methodical and brilliantly executed campaigns that would in just a few short years forge an empire that rivaled any in Europe. His first movements were to the west, toward the great Pannonian Basin, the vast plains fed by the Dacia and the middle Danube. This region was populated by powerful Celtic tribes, most notably the Boii and the Taurishi, who had themselves migrated there centuries before, establishing their own oppida, or fortified towns, and who were a constant, competing presence on Dacia's western frontier. For Burebista, these tribes were not just neighbors, they were a challenge and an obstacle. In a campaign that Strabo describes with stark brevity, Burebista completely destroyed them. This was not a border skirmish. It was a war of annihilation, or at the very least, total subjugation. The Dacian army, fueled by the promise of immortality and led by a general of singular strategic vision, rolled across the plains, shattering the Celtic defenses. We are left to imagine the clash of these two great Iron Age traditions, the Dacian Falks and howling Draco's standard against the long swords, chainmail, and vibrant checked cloaks of the Celtic warlords. The result, according to our sources, was a resounding Dacian victory. The power of the Boii was broken so completely that the region of their former kingdom, in what is now Slovakia and western Hungary, became known to the ancient world as the Desertum Boiorum, the desert of the Boii, an echo of the desolation left in the wake of Burebista's campaign. With this victory, he had pushed the western boundary of his new empire to the middle Danube, absorbing a vast and fertile territory and removing his most significant regional rival. But the king's gaze was not fixed only on the west. It swept in all directions, a 360-degree vision of expansion. He turned his armies south, across the Danube, a river that had for so long been the traditional boundary of the Getic peoples. He marched deep into the lands that would one day become the Roman province of Moesia, in modern Serbia and northern Bulgaria. He subdued the Thracian tribes of the region, the Scordici, the Dardani, and the Tribali, forcing them to accept his overlordship. This move was audacious in the extreme. It was a direct projection of power into the Balkan heartland, a region that the Roman Republic, now firmly established in Macedonia to the south, was beginning to view as its own natural backyard, its sphere of influence. Burebista was, with every mile his army marched south, drawing a new map, one that was in direct conflict with the ambitions of Rome. Then, having secured the west and the south, he turned east toward the prize that would fund his new empire, the Black Sea coast. For centuries, the western shore of the Euxine Sea had been home to a string of wealthy, sophisticated, and fiercely independent Greek city-states. Polis like Histria, Tomis, Calatis, Mesembria, Apollonia, and Odessos. These cities, founded centuries earlier by colonists from Miletus and other Ionian centers, were the vital gateways of commerce, the points where the resources of the barbarian interior, grain, honey, timber, salt, and slaves, were exchanged for the wine, olive oil, fine pottery, and silver of the Aegean world. They were immensely rich, and they were protected by strong stone walls and their own fleets. Burebista coveted their wealth, and more importantly, their strategic control of the trade routes. One by one, he laid siege to them. The cities, which had long paid tribute to various Thracian chieftains, but had never faced a unified, singular power like this, were overwhelmed. Some may have negotiated, others were likely stormed. By the end of his campaign, Burebista was the master of the entire coastline, from Olbia at the mouth of the Bug River in the north, all the way down to Apollonia, modern Sozopol in Bulgaria, in the south. The scale of this achievement is staggering to contemplate. In a matter of 1 or 2 decades, a single man had unified a scattered people and then used them to build an empire that stretched from the woody Carpathians and the desertum Boiorum in the west to the salty spray of the Black Sea in the east, from the vast plains of the Ukraine in the north, down across the Danube to the foothills of the Balkan Mountains. This was, for a brief, shining moment, the largest and most powerful political entity in Europe, outside of the Roman Republic itself. Burebista was no longer a tribal chieftain. He was the Rex Regum, the king of kings, an emperor in all but name, ruling over Celts, Thracians, Getae, Dacians, and Greeks. This new, colossal state, however, was not a centrally administered empire like Rome's. It was, in all likelihood, a vast web of personal loyalties and tributary obligations, all held together by the singular, charismatic, and terrifying figure of Burebista himself and the spiritual authority of his high priest. The conquered tribes and cities almost certainly retained their local customs, but they paid their taxes, they provided soldiers for his armies, and they obeyed his commands. And as the 60s and 50s BC ticked by, this new Dacian empire, this colossus of the north, began to cast a very long shadow, a shadow that fell directly across the path of an ambitious Roman governor in Gaul, a man by the name of Gaius Julius Caesar. This new, sprawling Dacian empire, which stretched from the desolate plains of the Boii to the bustling ports of the Black Sea, was no longer a distant rumor in the halls of Rome. It was a geopolitical fact, a dark and powerful mass looming on the northeastern frontier. The 50s and 40s Basti were a time of profound, chaotic, and violent transformation for the Roman Republic, a period when the state was convulsing in the long, drawn-out civil wars that would ultimately kill it and birth an empire in its place. Power was no longer held by the Senate and the people, but by a handful of colossal, ambitious individuals. Crassus, Pompey the Great, and most dazzlingly Julius Caesar, who was at that very moment completing his brutal, brilliant conquest of Gaul. This Roman world was a landscape of titanic egos, and Burebista's kingdom had just become a new, unavoidable feature on their strategic map. His raids south of the Danube were no longer simple barbarian incursions. They were attacks on the buffer zones of the Roman province of Macedonia, a direct challenge to the Pax Romana, and a personal affront to the Roman governors, tasked with defending the border. The fates of these two great consolidating powers, Dacia and Rome, were now inextricably linked. As the Roman Republic finally fractured, splitting into the two great factions of Caesar and Pompey, the ensuing civil war, 49 to 45 BC, echoed across the entire Mediterranean world and beyond. Every king, every client state, every tribe from Syria to Spain was forced to consider a side. Neutrality was a dangerous gamble, and Burebista, the king of kings, was now far too powerful to be ignored. He had to make a choice, and in 48 BC, he made one that would be fateful. As Pompey the Great, representing the established power of the Senate, gathered his forces in Greece for the final, decisive confrontation with Caesar, Burebista sent ambassadors. The Dacian king, perhaps seeing Pompey as the more legitimate or stable partner, or perhaps simply sensing an opportunity to weaken Rome by backing one side against the other, formally allied himself with the Pompeian faction. He offered troops and support, a significant pledge from the master of the North. This act, this strategic alliance, was a roll of the dice in the highest stakes game of the ancient world, and it was a spectacular failure. In the summer of 48 BC, at the Battle of Pharsalus in central Greece, Caesar's veteran legions, though outnumbered, utterly shattered Pompey's army. Pompey himself fled the field, eventually making his way to Egypt, where he was ignominiously assassinated on a lonely beach. Burebista's chosen ally was dead, his faction destroyed, and he was now left to face the consequences. He had, with that single diplomatic overture, transformed Dacia from a frontier problem into a personal enemy of the most ruthless and effective military commander the world had ever known, Gaius Julius Caesar. And Caesar, as he spent the next few years mopping up the last remnants of Pompeian resistance in Africa and Spain, did not forget the king in the north who had dared to back his rival. By 44 BC, Caesar was the undisputed master of the Roman world. He had returned to Rome, been declared dictator perpetuo, or dictator for life, and was at the absolute zenith of his power. And with the civil wars concluded, his restless, ambitious mind turned to the unfinished business of the frontiers and to the new glories that conquest could bring. He began to plan a campaign that, had it been launched, would have dwarfed even his conquest of Gaul in its scale and audacity. He planned a great war in the east, a war against two enemies. The first was the Parthian Empire, the great power in Mesopotamia that had 9 years earlier humiliated Rome by destroying the army of Crassus at Carrhae and capturing its legionary standards. But the other, the immediate target, was Burebista's Dacia. Caesar, it seems, intended to settle that score and to remove the northern threat once and for all. The preparations he made were immense. Contemporary sources, like Appian, speak of an army of 16 legions, upwards of 80,000 men, and 10,000 cavalry being assembled in Macedonia and Illyricum for this grand expedition. This was not a punitive force. It was a wave of annihilation, an army of conquest. The plan was set to launch in the spring of 44 BC. Caesar himself was in Rome, making the final political arrangements before he would depart to join his legions and march north across the Danube. This has left historians with one of the most tantalizing what-if scenarios in all of history. What was the full strategic scope of this plan? Some have hypothesized that Dacia was only the first step in a truly breathtaking pincer movement. Caesar, they suggest, would conquer Dacia, pacify the region, and then, rather than returning to Rome, he would march his victorious army east, swinging around the Black Sea and through the Caucasus to invade the Parthian Empire from the north, an unexpected and undefended direction. It was a plan of almost superhuman ambition. The legions were mustered. The supplies were gathered. The world held its breath, awaiting the inevitable collision of the two greatest empires and the two most powerful men of their age. Burebista, in his mountain capital, must have been aware of the storm gathering to his south, a storm of Roman steel he himself had helped to conjure, and then on a single day, the 15th of March, 44 BC, history turned on the point of a dagger. Julius Caesar, walking into a meeting of the Senate at the theater of Pompey, was surrounded by a conspiracy of senators and stabbed to death. In that one bloody moment, the entire grand campaign collapsed. The legions were left without their commander. The Roman world was instantly plunged back into a new and even more bitter civil war, and the invasion of Dacia was simply abandoned. Burebista, the great king, had been saved not by his falx-wielding armies, but by a bloody toga on a Senate floor in a city hundreds of miles away. The great reckoning between Dacia and Rome had been postponed, a final dramatic reprieve for the Northern Empire. The daggers that struck down Gaius Julius Caesar on that fateful March day in 44 BC did more than just kill a man. They vaporized a clear and present danger to the entire Dacian nation, dissolving an army of 16 legions that had been poised to march north. This sudden, almost miraculous reprieve, delivered not by Dacian arms, but by the internal politics of their enemy, must have felt like a profound intervention by Zalmoxis himself. Yet history rarely grants such uncomplicated victories, and its sense of symmetry can be both poetic and incredibly cruel. For in one of history's most stunning and least known coincidences, at almost the exact same moment that Caesar's ambition was being extinguished on the floor of the Roman Senate, the very same fate was visiting his great northern rival. In that same chaotic year of 44 BC, or perhaps just shortly after, Burebista, the great unifier, the king of kings, was himself struck down by an assassin's blade. The two titans who had been fated to clash, the masters of Rome and Dacia, were both removed from the board by their own people at the same historical instant. The man who had forged an empire, who had united the scattered tribes through sheer will and brilliant strategy, had, it seems, created a structure that was too rigid, too dependent on his own singular presence. The ancient sources are sparse on the details, a mere whisper in the grand narrative of Rome's collapse, but Strabo states it clearly. Burebista was overthrown by a sedition, a plot hatched among his own subjects, his own aristocracy. We are left with a profound historiographical mystery, a void where the names of the conspirators and their precise motives should be. We can only speculate, tracing the likely fractures in the empire he had built. Perhaps it was the Terrabostes, the cap-wearing nobles, the very men he had conquered and brought to heel. For decades, they had been masters of their own Davae, loyal only to their own ambitions, their culture one of fierce independence. Burebista, with the stern, ascetic guidance of the high priest Dacian, had changed all that. He had demanded obedience. He had demanded soldiers, and most famously, he had demanded they cut down their vines and live without wine. This last edict, a move toward a new, sober, and disciplined state, must have been deeply resented by an aristocracy accustomed to the old ways, to the feasting and the boisterous, wine-fueled gatherings that defined their status. Burebista had demanded they become cogs in an imperial machine, and they had, it seems, waited for a moment of perceived weakness, perhaps the looming threat of Caesar's invasion, which must have terrified the entire kingdom, to strike back and reclaim their lost autonomy. His very success, his consolidation of all power into his own hands, had become his greatest vulnerability. He had built an empire, but he had not had time to build an imperial state, an administrative structure that could survive his own death. The empire was Burebista, and Burebista was the empire. And so, when he fell, the entire vast and recently built edifice fell with him. The collapse was immediate, total, and catastrophic. The vast territory he had conquered, that sweeping claim from the Pannonian Basin to the Black Sea, simply evaporated. The subjugated Celtic tribes, the Scordici and Dardani south of the Danube, the wealthy Greek cities on the coast, all of them broke away, their tributary obligations vanishing with the king who had imposed them. The empire, built in a lifetime, crumbled in a day. But the fragmentation did not stop at the old borders. It cut deep into the Dacian heartland itself. The unity that Burebista had forged by fire and faith was shattered. Strabo, writing a few decades after the event, tells us that at the time of Burebista's death, the kingdom was immediately divided into 4 separate principalities. By the time Strabo himself was finishing his Geographica, around 23 AD, the situation had deteriorated even further, with the land having been split into 5 smaller kingdoms. The wolves, once united into a single terrifying pack, had returned to feuding amongst themselves. Dacia was, once again, a fractured land of competing chieftains. Yet one element of Burebista's revolution did, it seems, survive him. The high priest, Dacian, the man from the holy mountain of Cogaionon, the spiritual engine of the unified kingdom, did not fall. In the power vacuum left by the king's assassination, the priest's authority appears to have grown. Jordanes, a later historian drawing on older Roman sources, claims that Dacian, seeing the kingdom fragment, took on a larger role, not just as a spiritual guide, but as a de facto ruler, or at least the stabilizing force for the core kingdom in the Orestier Mountains. He was held, Jordanes writes, in wonderful veneration, and he passed his authority, both royal and priestly, to a successor named Camusicus, who was held in like regard. This suggests a fascinating outcome. While the vast political empire of Burebista was lost forever, the sacred kingdom at its heart, the region around Sarmizegetusa Regia, endured. It transitioned into a kind of theocracy, a state ruled by a line of priest-kings, with the god Zalmoxis, via his high priest, as the true sovereign. This sacred center, this bastion of Dacian faith and identity, would become the nucleus from which Dacian power would one day rise again. But for now, as the 1st century BC bled into the 1st century AD, the Dacians were divided and vulnerable, and to the south, the chaotic Roman civil wars were finally ending, giving way to the cold, methodical, and unblinking gaze of a new, unified, and truly terrifying power, the Roman Empire, under its first, brilliant, and patient emperor, Augustus. While the vast, fleeting empire of Burebista had shattered almost as quickly as it was built, its core did not dissolve. The heart of Dacia, That sacred nucleus in the southern Carpathian highlands of Transylvania held firm, a bastion of the Zalmoxian faith, now governed by the line of priest kings that began with Decianus. This was a land that needed not just a leader, but a focal point. Not just a deva on a trade route, but a true capital, a place that could serve as both the ultimate fortress and the supreme national sanctuary. And so, in the decades following the Great Fragmentation, the Dacian kings began a monumental construction project, one that would become the physical and spiritual crown of their civilization, a vast, sophisticated complex of fortresses nestled high in the Orishti Mountains. This system, centered on its capital, Sarmizegethusa Regia, was a masterpiece of pre-Roman barbarian engineering, a statement in stone and timber that the Dacian wolf was no longer a scattered woodland hunter, but a king upon a mountain throne. The location itself was a strategic revelation, chosen not for ease of access, but for its profound inaccessibility. The Orishti Mountains are a rugged, densely forested cluster of high peaks and deep, winding valleys. To even approach the area required navigating narrow, treacherous passes, easily defended by a small, determined force. Here, on a series of peaks ranging from 800 to 1,200 meters high, the Dacians erected a network of 6 primary strongholds, each a sentinel guarding an approach to the sacred capital. Fortresses like Kosteshti Tsetetsue, Kosteshti Blidaru, and Piatra Roshi were not mere watchtowers. They were formidable citadels in their own right, built to function as a layered, interlocking defense. An invader who managed to breach one pass would find themselves forced to lay siege to a high-altitude fortress, all while the other citadels could rain down reinforcements or attack their supply lines. It was a deadly defensive web, and at its center, hidden deepest within the range, lay the royal and sacred capital itself, Sarmizegethusa Regia. Sarmizegethusa was a city built on a scale and with a sophistication that continues to astonish archaeologists. It was not a primitive hill fort. It was a sprawling, planned settlement composed of 3 distinct and vital parts. The first was the fortress, the military heart, perched on the high ridge. Its walls were a testament to a unique and highly effective building technique, a hybrid of local tradition, and very likely engineering knowledge imported from the Hellenistic world. This technique, known today as Murus Daciacus, or the Dacian wall, was a marvel of flexibility and strength. The builders would first construct 2 parallel walls of precisely cut rectangular limestone blocks, creating a thick outer and inner face. But instead of filling the gap with simple rubble, they laid down a core of earth and stone, and then most crucially, they locked the entire structure together with massive, interlinking horizontal timber beams, their ends sometimes dovetailed into the stone blocks themselves. This design was ingenious. The stone provided a formidable face against fire and battering rams, while the flexible core of earth and timber beams acted as a kind of shock absorber, capable of absorbing the vibrations from siege engines or even earthquakes, preventing the wall from cracking and collapsing as a rigid, mortared wall might. Below this imposing fortress, the mountainside was carved into a series of broad, artificial terraces, creating a substantial civilian settlement. This is where the Terabastes aristocracy lived, where the kingdom's administrators worked, and where the elite artisans practiced their crafts. Excavations here have uncovered a world of industry, forges, and blacksmiths' workshops filled with iron tools, anvils, and slag, kilns for firing the distinctive high-quality Dacian pottery, and the workshops of jewelers who worked the gold and silver brought from the rich Carpathian mines. This was the engine room of the kingdom, a bustling, high-altitude city protected by the citadel above. But the true soul of Sarmizegethusa, the feature that elevates it from a mere fortress to a place of profound mystery, lay in its third component, the sacred precinct. Located on a terrace below the fortress, this was a large, open-air complex of temples, built not in the style of their Roman or Greek counterparts, but according to a unique Dacian cosmology. Here, archaeologists uncovered the foundations of several rectangular temples, their stone bases once supporting tall wooden columns. But the centerpiece, a truly enigmatic structure, was the great circular sanctuary. This was a complex, concentric arrangement of stone blocks and thick timber posts, its geometry precise and deliberate. It consisted of an outer ring of andesite blocks, a smaller ring of timber posts, an inner ring of smaller timber posts, and at the center, a small horseshoe-shaped apse of stone blocks. The mystery of this structure, this Dacian Stonehenge, is still debated. The precise alignments, the number of posts and blocks, all suggest a sophisticated purpose beyond simple worship. It was almost certainly a calendar, a solar and astronomical observatory. The priests of Zalmoxis, guided by the wisdom of Decaneus, were not just spiritual guides. They were the timekeepers, the astronomers who tracked the solstices and the equinoxes, who dictated the planting seasons and the auspicious dates for war and ritual. Here, in this ring of stone and wood, under the cold, clear mountain sky, the priest-kings would have stood measuring the slow, celestial dance of the sun and moon. Nearby, a large, intricately carved andesite altar, often called the andesite sun, was found, its surface designed with channels, likely for liquid libations, wine, perhaps now only for ritual, water, or the blood of sacrifices, to flow in prescribed patterns, an offering to the god who lived in the earth below. This mountain fortress was, therefore, the complete embodiment of the Dacian state, an impregnable military citadel, a living royal city, and a celestial observatory, the point where the earthly power of the king and the divine knowledge of the god Zalmoxis met. The construction of this immense, high-altitude sanctuary at Sarmizegethusa Regia, with its interlocking network of 6 formidable fortresses, its Murus Daciacus walls, and its enigmatic, stargazing circular temples, was a project of staggering ambition and cost. Such an undertaking, far from the fertile river plains, deep in the rugged mountains, could not have been funded by tribute of grain and cattle alone. It required a river of liquid wealth, a reliable and immense source of capital to pay for the legions of laborers, the skilled stonemasons, the architects, and the vast quantities of iron needed for tools and timber beams. This wealth, the lifeblood of the newly centralized Dacian kingdom, did not have to be imported. It was quite literally the foundation upon which the Dacians lived. Their power, their art, and ultimately their doom was rooted in the very rocks of the Carpathian Mountains, for this was one of the richest gold-bearing regions in the entire ancient world. We now refer to this specific area, nestled within the Apuseni Mountains of western Transylvania, as the Golden Quadrilateral. It is a place where for millennia Tectonic activity has forced gold and silver up from the Earth's core, lacing the quartz veins of the mountains with a glittering, irresistible promise. The Dacians, and their ancestors before them, had been working these deposits for centuries, long before the rise of Burebista. At first, it was likely simple alluvial mining, the patient work of panning the cold mountain streams, sifting the heavy, bright flakes from the gravel and silt. But as their society grew in complexity, as the Dave became centers of industry, and the Terrabostes aristocracy developed a thirst for status, the Dacians became expert hard rock miners. They learned to follow the quartz veins deep into the mountain sides, driving cuniculi, or narrow galleries, into the stone, their way lit only by the smoky, flickering glow of animal fat lamps. The archaeological evidence for this industry is extensive, though often overshadowed by the later, much larger scale Roman mining that would follow. At sites like Rossia Montana, known in antiquity as Alburnus Mire, we find the remnants of these pre-Roman operations. The simple iron picks and chisels, the stone hammers, and the wooden shovels worn smooth by heavy use. It was brutal, claustrophobic work, likely performed by slaves captured in war or by the lowest classes of the commodity, a life spent in the cold, damp darkness, chipping away at the obdurate stone to extract the precious ore. This ore was then hauled into the daylight, crushed with massive stone mills, and washed, the heavy gold particles separating from the lighter rock. Finally, in the forges of the Davai workshops, the gold was smelted, the fires roaring as the raw metal was purified into gleaming heavy ingots, ready to be transformed by the kingdom's smiths. And the smiths of Dacia were masters. This flow of wealth was not simply hoarded as bullion. It was shaped into objects of immense power and beauty. The most famous and enigmatic of these are the Dacian Cosoni, the only gold coins ever minted by the Dacians. These coins present a fascinating historiographical puzzle, a perfect mystery that blends Dacian and Roman history. On one side, they clearly depict a Roman consul walking between two lictors, his bodyguards, an image copied directly from a Roman Republican Zenarius, minted by Marcus Junius Brutus in 54 BC. On the other side, an eagle stands on a scepter, holding a laurel wreath. For decades, historians have debated their origin. Were these coins minted by the Dacians, who simply copied a Roman design they found reliable, perhaps to pay their own mercenaries? Or, as a more tantalizing theory suggests, were they minted by Brutus himself after he and his co-conspirators had assassinated Julius Caesar in 44 BC? In this version, Brutus, desperately needing allies and funds for the coming civil war against Octavian and Antony, might have sent a vast payment of his own coins to the Dacian king, seeking to hire the fierce northern warriors for his cause. The fact that these coins are found almost exclusively within the borders of Dacia leaves the question beautifully, maddeningly open. Perhaps even more stunning than the coins or the massive, ritualistic gold bracelets, the spiralelle dacis. Dozens of these have been found, often in great caches buried near Sarmizegetusa, as if hidden in a time of great peril. These are not delicate pieces of jewelry. They are monumental works of art, some weighing over a kilogram, several pounds each. They consist of a thick, solid gold rod, coiled into a tight, heavy spiral, often ending in stylized serpent or wolf heads. To wear such an object on one's arm would be a statement of almost unimaginable wealth and power, likely reserved for the Terabastes aristocracy or the priests of Zalmoxis, worn only during the most important state ceremonies. They gleam with a raw, barbarian elegance, a testament to the immense resources at the king's command. This river of gold funded everything. It paid for the Murus Dacicus, it armed the soldiers with their iron falx blades, and it paid for the Greek and Roman engineers who may have helped design the fortresses. But a beacon that shines so brightly is visible from a great distance. To the south, the Roman Empire, now stable and rapaciously expanding, was always in need of precious metals to pay its vast legions and fund its monumental building projects. The rumors and reports from traders, from spies, and from Roman governors on the Danube frontier all spoke of Dacia's mountains. They were not just a wilderness of defiant wolf warriors, they were a treasure chest. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing over a century later, would claim that after Trajan's eventual conquest, the Romans captured an unbelievable 5 million pounds of silver and 2 million pounds of gold. Modern historians rightly view these numbers with deep skepticism, as they are likely wild exaggerations, propaganda designed to magnify the glory of the victory. But even if the true amount was a mere tenth of that figure, it would still represent one of the single greatest influxes of wealth into the Roman treasury in its entire history. Dacia's gold, the very source of its strength, was now a powerful magnet, drawing the envious, unblinking gaze of Rome. The mountains that had made the Dacians rich had also made them an irresistible target, while the high-altitude fortresses of Sarmizegethusa Regia and the gleaming heavy gold of the Apuseni mines represented the power and wealth of the Dacian Terabastes aristocracy. The true foundation of the kingdom was, as with all ancient civilizations, far quieter and more commonplace. It rested in the fertile, dark soil of the river valleys and the broad, rolling plains of the Transylvanian basin. The Dacian state was not an ethereal castle of gold. It was a living, breathing social organism, a complex society built firmly on the labor of its farmers, the skill of its smiths, and the constant flowing current of its trade. The vast majority of the Dacian people, the Komati or long-haired ones, were not cap-wearing nobles or high priests. They were farmers and herders, their lives dictated not by royal edicts, but by the slow, turning rhythm of the seasons. The land of Dacia was one of stark, beautiful contrasts. It had the rugged, forested mountains, but it also possessed vast tracts of exceptionally fertile land. The Mureș, Someș, and Olt river valleys, and the great plains of Wallachia, south of the mountains, were rich alluvial basins, perfect for the cultivation of grains. Here, in countless small, undefended villages, the Komati lived in their characteristic dwellings, simple, rectangular houses, their floors often dug a foot or two into the earth, Grubenhäuser, a design that provided natural insulation against the bitter cold of winter and the heat of summer. The walls were made of a sturdy timber frame, packed with a mixture of woven branches and clay, the timeless wattle and daub, and topped with a heavy, steeply pitched thatched roof to shed the rain and snow. Around these clusters of homes, the fields stretched out, a patchwork of wheat, barley, millet, and rye, alongside plots of beans, peas, and lentils. This agricultural bounty was the engine of the kingdom, the food that fed the soldiers, the miners, and the priests on the holy mountain. Beyond the plowed fields lay the pastures, and the Dacians, like their Thracian ancestors, were renowned herdsmen. Great flocks of sheep grazed the hillsides, providing the wool that was spun and woven in every household to create the distinctive white cloaks and tunics seen on their Roman depictions. Herds of cattle provided meat, milk, and crucially, the traction power for the heavy wooden plows that broke the soil. And then there were the horses. The Dacians were famed horsemen, their cavalry a swift and deadly arm of their military, their Terrabostes nobles often fighting from horseback. These herds of tough, agile horses were a vital part of their wealth and their warrior identity. Life here was a constant, cyclical pattern of plowing in the spring, shepherding in the summer, and a frantic communal effort of harvesting in the autumn, followed by the long, quiet winter, spent indoors, mending tools, weaving cloth, and listening to the howl of the wolf, the dows, outside the village fence. This agricultural life was made possible by the other great pillar of Dacian society, its metalwork. The forges of the Davae and the mountain capital were not just producing the terrifying falques or the ritualistic gold spirals. They were, more importantly, hammering out the essential tools of civilization. The Dacian blacksmith was a figure of immense local importance, the master of a technology that was still, in many parts of the world, a near magical art. From the iron smelted with charcoal from the endless forests, these smiths produced the heavy iron plowshares needed to cut through the dense soil, the curved sickles and long scythes for the grain harvest, the axes and adzes for felling timber and shaping the beams of their houses, and the knives, chisels, and hammers for every other craft. This widespread, sophisticated iron industry made the Dacians remarkably self-sufficient. They did not need to import their basic tools. They forged them, and the quality of their work was renowned. These two strands, a productive agricultural surplus and a robust iron industry, fed directly into the third, the complex web of trade that tied Dacia to the entire ancient world. The kingdom's central artery was the mighty Danube River, which the Dacians called the Donaris or Istros. This was not a border, it was a highway, a vast flowing corridor of commerce. From the fortified Davos that acted as trading posts along its banks, Dacian merchants, or more likely Greek and Roman intermediaries, loaded barges with the kingdom's immense surplus. The primary export was grain, a commodity always in demand by the populous cities of Greece, and increasingly by the Roman legions stationed along the frontier. But they also shipped timber, hewn from the virgin Carpathian forests, as well as honey, beeswax, cured meats, and valuable hides. And of course, there was the salt, mined from great natural deposits, a crucial preservative and a staple of ancient trade. In the other direction, up the river, came the goods that the Dacian aristocracy craved: fine, painted Greek pottery, bronze vessels, glassware, and above all, jars of wine and olive oil from the Mediterranean, the archaeological markers of a society with wealth to spend on foreign luxuries. This river trade connected them to the Black Sea, and from there to the entire Aegean and Roman world. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered economy, a robust and complex society that was far more than the simple savage kingdom of Roman propaganda. It was a nation of farmers, smiths, and merchants, capable of feeding itself, arming itself, and funding a magnificent, golden civilization deep within its mountain heart. The grand, unified empire of Burebista, which had for a moment cast a shadow over Rome itself, was now a fractured memory, a grand tapestry unraveled by the daggers of its own nobility. In the century that followed his assassination, the political landscape of Dacia reverted to its older, more fractured state. The kingdom, as Strabo had noted, had split into 4 and then 5 smaller principalities, each ruled by its own Terabastes king, each vying for supremacy, or at least survival. The central sacred kingdom, based in the mountain fortress of Sarmizegathusa Regia, was now in the hands of the priest kings, the line of Dacians, who held the spiritual heart of the nation. But the fertile plains and the rich river valleys were once again a patchwork of competing loyalties. And to the south, the chaotic, bloody civil wars of the Roman Republic had finally burned themselves out, leaving in their wake the cold, calculating, and unthinkably vast power of the new Roman Empire, all of it now consolidated under the singular genius of its first emperor, Augustus. The relationship between Rome and Dacia, therefore, entered a new and complex phase. The Dacians were no longer a single, existential threat, demanding a massive, Caesarian-style invasion. Instead, they were a persistent frontier problem, a collection of restless, warlike kingdoms that had to be managed, intimidated, and played against one another. For the Dacian kings of this era, life was a precarious and dangerous diplomatic game, a constant balancing act on the edge of a Roman sword. They were caught between the proud, defiant memory of Burebista's independence and the overwhelming immediate reality of Roman legions massing just across the Danube, which was now hardening from a mere river into a fortified, militarized imperial limes. One of the most prominent of these post-Burebista rulers, a man whose name echoed in the poetry and histories of Rome itself, was a king named Cotiso. We know frustratingly little about him, but what we do know paints a perfect portrait of this difficult era. Cotiso ruled a significant kingdom in the mountains, likely in the Banat region or Oltenia, just north of the Danube, placing him in direct, unavoidable contact with the Roman frontier. He was, by all accounts, a capable and ambitious warrior king, commanding a formidable army that the Romans took very seriously. The poet Horace, writing in Rome during Augustus's reign, mentions the army of Cotiso, Cotisonus Agmen, in the same breath as other great threats to the empire, a casual name drop that proves Cotiso was a well-known contemporary bogeyman for the Roman public. Cotiso's reign coincided with the final, convulsive civil war of the Republic, the conflict between Octavian, the future Augustus, and his rival Mark Antony. Like Burebista before him, Cotiso found himself in the unenviable position of having to choose a side, or at least being courted by both. The historian Suetonius, in his Life of Augustus, recounts a fascinating and in all likelihood wildly propagandistic story about this diplomatic maneuvering. He claims that Antony, desperate for allies, tried to secure an alliance with Cotiso. Octavian, in a masterful stroke of counter-propaganda, then spread a rumor of his own. He let it be known that he, Octavian, was the one truly allied with the Dacians, and that he had gone so far as to betroth his own 5-year-old daughter, Julia, to King Cotiso, and that he, in turn, would marry Cotiso's own daughter. The story was almost certainly a fabrication, a smear designed to paint Octavian's rival, Antony, as a man willing to make treasonous pacts with barbarians. But the very fact that Cotiso was the barbarian chosen for this story speaks volumes. He was a king of sufficient power and notoriety that a rumor of a marriage alliance with his family was a believable and potent political weapon in Rome. This was the nature of the difficult politics these kings had to navigate. They were chess pieces in Rome's internal power struggles, all while trying to maintain their own sovereignty. And when Rome was finally unified under Augustus, the game changed. There were no more Roman factions to play against each other, only the singular, unified will of the emperor. Augustus's policy was one of aggressive frontier defense. He would not tolerate the old Dacian habit of raiding across the Danube when the river froze in winter. He tasked his best generals, most notably Marcus Licinius Crassus, the grandson of the triumvir, with pacifying the entire region. In 29 to 28 BC, Crassus waged a brutal and effective campaign in Moesia, pushing deep into the lands south of the river, defeating not just the Dacians, but their Bastarnae and Getae allies. He was, as the sources claim, the first Roman general to personally kill an enemy king in single combat, for which he was awarded a triumph in Rome. For kings like Cotiso, the world was shrinking. They were being pressed from the south by a patient, methodical, and relentless imperial power, a power that was building roads, bridges, and legionary fortresses all along the Danube. They could still lead their howling, falx-wielding warriors in raids, but the price of failure was now total annihilation. Cotiso himself, after years of walking this tightrope, eventually fell. His kingdom was defeated by the Romans, and he, according to some sources, was taken captive. His fate, like that of his kingdom, was to be absorbed into the ever-expanding machinery of the Roman frontier. This was the fate of Dacia in the age of Augustus, a proud, fragmented people, still rich in gold and fierce in spirit, but now living in the long, cold shadow of an empire that had finally put its own house in order and was beginning very patiently to look north. For several decades following the reign of Augustus, the Danube frontier, while never truly quiet, settled into a tense but stable rhythm. The fragmented Dacian principalities continued their internal squabbles, and the Roman Empire, under the Julio-Claudian emperors, was often more consumed by its own spectacular internal dramas, the intrigues of Tiberius, the madness of Caligula, the great fire of Nero, than by a cohesive policy of northern expansion. The legions patrolled the river, and the Dacians largely kept to their side, their raids becoming more sporadic, their kings perhaps understanding the new, permanent reality of the Roman limes. This was a period of containment, a long, low-simmering standoff. But as the 1st century AD drew to a close, this fragile equilibrium was destined to be shattered. The Flavian dynasty, forged in the brutal civil war of 69 AD, had taken control of Rome, and its last emperor, Domitian, was a man of deeply complicated, insecure, and autocratic ambition. He craved a military legacy to match that of his father, Vespasian, and his brother Titus, the conquerors of Judea, and he looked to the frontiers for a war that would cement his own glory. Simultaneously across the Danube, something momentous was happening in the Dacian heartland. The long period of fragmentation was ending. The power of the priest kings in Sarmizegetusa Regia, combined with the ambition of a new line of warrior kings, was once again pulling the disparate tribes together. A new, singular leader was emerging from the Terabastes aristocracy, a man of profound military and political genius, known at first as Diurpanius. Under his leadership, the Dacians, perhaps sensing Domitian's desire for a glorious war, or perhaps simply feeling their own resurgent strength, began to test the Roman border with a new coordinated ferocity. In the winter of 85-86 AD, this testing exploded into a full-scale crisis. A massive Dacian warband, led by this new king, crossed the frozen Danube and swept into the Roman province of Moesia. This was not a raid, it was an invasion. They met the Roman defenders, and in a catastrophic battle, they annihilated them. The Roman governor of Moesia, Oppius Sabinus, was killed, his head paraded on a spike, and the Dacian warriors rampaged through the province, looting villas, capturing prisoners, and, most humiliatingly, seizing the standards of the defeated Roman forces. For Domitian, this was both a terrible crisis and a golden opportunity. The humiliation was profound, but it provided the perfect casus belli for the grand war he had always wanted. He raced to the frontier, bringing with him the elite Praetorian Guard and its ambitious prefect, Cornelius Fuscus. He organized a massive counter-offensive, splitting the strained province of Moesia into two, Moesia Superior and Inferior, to create a more responsive military command structure. He was determined to not just repel the Dacians, but to march into their homeland, break their power, and return to Rome as a conquering hero. In 87 AD, he gave the order, entrusting the invasion to Cornelius Fuscus. Fuscus, a man more known for political loyalty than seasoned frontier command, built a pontoon bridge across the Danube and led his army, including the veteran Legio V Alaudes, deep into the unknown, forested valleys of Dacia. The Dacian king, Diurpanius, was waiting. He was a brilliant tactician, a master of his own difficult terrain. He employed the classic strategy of the wolf. He feigned weakness, drawing the Roman army deeper and deeper into the mountains, stretching their supply lines thin, leading them toward a narrow, heavily wooded pass. This pass, known to history as Tapae, likely the modern iron gates of Transylvania, a key gateway to the Dacian capital, was a perfect ambush site. When Fuscus's army was fully committed, its long column trapped between the steep, forested slopes, the Dacians struck. They poured down from the heights, the air filled with the howling of the Draco standards and the terrifying whistling arc of the Falg. The battle was a massacre. The Romans, unable to deploy into their classic fighting formations, were cut to pieces. Cornelius Fuscus himself was killed, and in the ultimate disgrace, Legio V Alaudae was effectively destroyed, and its legionary eagle, the sacred golden symbol of Rome's honor, was captured by the victorious Dacians. This was a disaster, on a scale Rome had not seen in decades, a humiliation that echoed the loss of Varus's legions in the Teutoburg forest. Domitian, who had remained behind the lines, was staggered. He hurried back to Rome to manage the political fallout, actually celebrating a contrived triumph over the Chatti, a German tribe, to mask the catastrophic failure in Dacia. But the frontier could not be ignored. The next year, 88 AD, he sent a new general, Tedius Julianus, a far more cautious and experienced commander. Julianus advanced slowly, meticulously, and met the Dacians again at the same dreadful pass of Tapae. This time, the Romans were prepared. After a brutal, grinding battle, Julianus's superior discipline won the day, and the Dacians were forced to retreat, though they were not broken. Julianus was poised to press his advantage, to march on Sarmizegethusa itself, But just at this moment of potential victory, history intervened. A revolt broke out on the Rhine, led by the governor Antonius Saturninus, forcing Domitian to pull troops from the Danube. Worse, the Germanic tribes of the Marcomanni and Quadi, seeing Rome overstretched, broke their own treaties and threatened to attack from the north, an attack perhaps coordinated with the Dacian king. Domitian was now in an impossible position, facing a war on two fronts and revolt at his back. He was forced to do the unthinkable. He sought peace with the very enemy who had killed his general and taken his eagle. The Dacian king, now so renowned for his victory that he had been given the honorific name Decebalus, the brave or the strong, accepted. And the terms of this peace, signed in 89 AD, were for Rome a source of profound shame. Decebalus was recognized as a client king, yes, but he was given a massive annual subsidy in gold and silver. Even more, Domitian agreed to send Decebalus a corps of Roman military engineers, siege specialists, and artisans. The emperor was, in effect, paying his enemy a bribe not to attack, and in a fit of almost incomprehensible strategic folly, was giving that same enemy the expert knowledge to make his mountain fortresses, the very ones Tedius Julianus had just failed to reach, all but impregnable. Domitian returned to Rome, claimed victory, and even held a triumph. But everyone in the Senate, everyone in the army, knew the truth. The Dacian king had won. He was now rich with Roman gold and armed with Roman knowledge, a standing, defiant challenge to the very idea of Roman invincibility. The Peace of 89 AD, a treaty that sent shudders of quiet shame through the Roman Senate, was a masterpiece of opportunism for the Dacian king. This man, who had entered the historical record as Diurpanius, was now known to the world by his new, formidable title, Decebalus. This was not a birth name, but an honorific, a crown of a name, likely meaning the strong, the brave, or perhaps strong as 10, a title bestowed upon him by his people in recognition of his staggering victory over the legions of Cornelius Fuscus. He was now, without question, the most famous barbarian king in the world, the man who had defeated an emperor, captured a Roman eagle, and forced the mixture of the world to pay him an annual salary not to fight. But Decebalus was far more than a lucky warlord. He was a statesman of profound, cold, and calculating genius, a unifier who saw this humiliating peace not as an end, but as a beginning, a precious, funded opportunity to prepare for the real war that he knew, with absolute certainty, was still to come. Roman historians, particularly Cassius Dio, writing over a century later, but drawing on contemporary accounts, paint a vivid and respectful portrait of their great enemy. Dio describes him as a man shrewd in his understanding of warfare, and shrewd also in the new, brilliant, and defiant king Decebalus rises to reunite the tribes against Rome. This perfectly encapsulates his character. He was not a wild, charging berserker leading a horde. He was a grand strategist. He knew precisely when to advance and when to retreat, luring Fuscus into the fatal trap at Tapae. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, of ambushes and feigned retreats, using the forested, mountainous terrain of Dacia as his greatest weapon. But he was also a master of diplomacy and deception, a man who, as Dio notes, knew how to make the most of a victory and how to bear a defeat well. He had seen the power of Tedius Julianus's legions, and rather than risk his kingdom in a final, glorious stand, He had cleverly accepted a peace that in reality was a stunning strategic victory. Now, in the last decade of the 1st century ADs, Decebalus used the terms of that peace with surgical precision. The first and most obvious benefit was the gold. The annual subsidies that flowed north from Rome's treasury were a river of wealth that supplemented Dacia's own rich mines. Decebalus used this money to consolidate his power, a process of unification that was as much diplomatic as it was military. He was, we must remember, a king who had risen to prominence among other Terabastes. He now had the funds to buy their loyalty, to make them his generals, to reward them with gifts of Roman gold and silver, binding the quarrelsome nobility of the lesser Daves to his central throne at Sarmizegetusa Regia. He was reforging the unity of Burebista, not just with the abstract spiritual authority of the high priest, but with the cold, hard, and very persuasive power of cash. But the second, and far more insidious provision of the treaty was the core of Roman artisans and engineers. Domitian had sent them, perhaps, to help build aqueducts or temples, a way to Romanize his new client king and make the peace seem like a civilizing mission. Decebalus, however, had no interest in building forums or public baths. He took these masters of Roman military engineering, the best the world had to offer, and he put them to work on the one thing that mattered, his walls. The great fortress complex in the Orestier Mountains, already formidable, was now upgraded with Roman know-how. The Murus Daciacus, that brilliant hybrid wall of stone and timber, was perfected, its cut stone facings made more precise, its internal timber lacing more robust. New Roman-style square towers were added to the ramparts, allowing for better enfilading fire. Water systems, the lifeblood of any fortress, were improved, with cisterns dug and clay pipe aqueducts laid to ensure the citadels could withstand a long siege. The winding, narrow roads that led up the mountain passes were improved, but only in ways that benefited the defenders, creating strategic choke points and hidden sally ports. Decebalus, funded by Roman gold and advised by Roman engineers, was turning Dacia's mountain heartland into the most sophisticated and deadly defensive system in the pre-modern world. He was, in effect, using Rome's own strength against it, beating them at their own game. This was the brilliant, defiant act of the new unifier. He was not just a king. He was a builder, a centralizer. He established a standing paid army, one that no longer simply mustered for a season's raid, but trained year-round, armed with the best falx blades the forges could produce. He reorganized the logistics of his kingdom, ensuring that grain from the plains could be swiftly transported and stored in the high-altitude granaries of his fortresses. He had, in the span of a decade, transformed Dacia from a dangerous tribal confederation into a centralized, fortified, and professional military state, all of it animated by his singular anti-Roman will. He was, in every sense, the new Burebista, but a Burebista who had learned the lessons of his predecessor's fall and who knew his enemy far more intimately. He sat in his mountain capital, a king of wolves, but a king who now also possessed the cunning of the Roman serpent, waiting patiently for the day the empire would return to reclaim its lost honor and its captive eagle. The humiliating blow that Decebalus had dealt to Emperor Domitian was far more than a simple battlefield victory. It was a deep, corrosive wound in the psychological armor of the Roman Empire. The Peace of 89 AD, signed under the duress of a new German threat and revolt on the Rhine, was not a treaty between equals. It was, in the cold, clear light of history, a ransom. The historians of the day and those who followed would try to spin it just as Domitian himself did, claiming a false triumph over a cowed and distant people. But in the halls of the Senate, in the barracks of the legions along the Danube, and in the mind of every Roman general, the truth was a bitter and indigestible fact. The empire was paying tribute, in gold and in knowledge, to a barbarian king. This king, Decebalus, had not only defeated a Roman army and killed its commander, he had captured the sacred eagle of Legio Vav Allodae, and that eagle, a symbol of Rome's very soul, was now, presumably, displayed as a trophy in the high, inaccessible mountain capital of Sarmizegetusa Regia. This peace, therefore, was a period of intense, focused, and funded preparation for the Dacian king, and a period of simmering, impotent shame for the Roman state. The annual subsidies that flowed north were substantial. While the exact figures are lost to us, the flow of Roman gold and silver into Dacia, evidenced by coin hoards unearthed by archaeologists, was significant. This was the fuel for the grand project Decebalus had undertaken, the work we explored previously, the transformation of his kingdom. This gold paid for the loyalty of the Terrabostes, binding the querulous, independent-minded aristocracy to his singular vision. It paid for the full-time salaries of a standing army, warriors who were no longer just farmers called to a seasonal raid, but professional soldiers trained in the use of the falx and drilled in the coordinated defense of their mountain passes. This gold, Roman gold, was being used to build a professional anti-Roman war machine. But the most staggering, almost incomprehensible part of the tribute was the technical assistance. Domitian, in his desperate haste to secure the frontier so he could turn his attention elsewhere, had agreed to send Decebalus a corps of Roman engineers, architects, siege specialists, and artisans. This was a strategic blunder of catastrophic proportions. It was like giving a rival forge master the secret to Damascus steel. Decebalus, a man described by his enemies as surpassingly shrewd, did not waste this gift. He did not build baths or villas. He put these men to work on his fortifications. The Murus Daciacus, the ingenious Dacian wall of stone, earth, and timber, was now perfected with Roman precision. The stonework became cleaner, the joints tighter. The internal timber lacing, designed to absorb the shock of siege engines, was refined. Roman-style square towers were added to the ramparts, their design allowing archers and artillery, like the ballistae the Romans themselves had now taught them to build, to lay down deadly interlocking fields of fire. We can imagine these Roman specialists, men whose loyalty was to their craft and their emperor's coin, working high in the Orestier Mountains, their Latin voices echoing in the cold, clear air as they directed Dacian laborers. They would have improved the water systems, laying terracotta pipes to feed the cisterns of the 6 great fortresses, ensuring the garrisons could withstand a siege not just for weeks, but for months or even years. They would have helped to grade the roads, but only in ways that served the defenders, creating strategic choke points and perfectly engineered ambush sites. Decebalus was, in effect, inoculating his kingdom against the very military science that made Rome invincible. He was using Roman knowledge to build an anti-Roman fortress, a citadel so formidable that it would require a new and even more determined Roman emperor to even contemplate attacking it. For a decade, this bizarre and tense peace held. From 89 AD through the dark, paranoid final years of Domitian's reign, the arrangement continued. Domitian, who had become increasingly tyrannical, was finally assassinated in 96 AD by members of his own court. His death marked the end of the Flavian dynasty, and in a moment of profound wisdom, the Senate chose not another soldier or a relative of the old emperor, but a quiet, elderly, and respected senator named Nerva. Nerva's reign was short, but he made one decision that would seal the fate of Dacia. He adopted as his son and heir a man who was the complete antithesis of Domitian. This man was Marcus Ulpius Traianus, or Trajan, a seasoned, brilliant, and universally respected general, at that time in command of the powerful legions on the German frontier. When Nerva died in 98 AD, Trajan became emperor, and with his ascension, the clock that had been paused in 89 AD began to tick once more. Trajan was not Domitian. He was a soldier's soldier, a man who had lived his entire life with the legions. He understood the shame of the lost eagle, and he felt the insult of the annual subsidy as a personal affront to the army's honor. The peace that Domitian had bought was, in Trajan's eyes, an unpaid debt, and the new emperor was a man who always, meticulously, paid what was owed, in this case, with iron and steel. When the elderly Nerva died in 98 AD, the man who ascended to the imperial throne in Rome was in every conceivable way the man Decebalus must have feared. This was not another Domitian, a vain and paranoid autocrat who craved the appearance of military glory while micromanaging his generals from a safe distance. The new emperor, Marcus Ulpius Traianus, was a man forged by the frontier, a soldier's soldier, born in the province of Hispania Baetica, not in the gilded halls of the Palatine. He had spent his entire adult life with the legions, rising through the ranks on merit, his face weathered by the winds of the Rhine and the Danube. He was a disciplinarian, a brilliant logistician, and a man who commanded a fierce, personal loyalty from his troops, not least because he was known to march beside them on foot, eat the same simple rations, and call his veteran centurions by name. His ambition was not for the fleeting applause of the Roman mob, but for the enduring, unshakable honor of the Roman army, an honor he felt had been personally stained by Domitian's humiliating treaty. For Trajan, the shame of 89 AD was not a political inconvenience. It was a festering wound. The captured eagle of the Legio Fiv Laude, the annual tributary payments of gold, and the corps of Roman engineers loaned to their own enemy, these were, in his mind, an intolerable state of affairs. The Dacian kingdom, under Decebalus, was not a distant, manageable client state. It was a defiant, well-funded, and now, thanks to Roman expertise, a terrifyingly well-defended fortress state, a dagger aimed at the empire's vulnerable Danube frontier. From the moment he took power, Trajan's primary undeclared policy was the systematic and total erasure of this Dacian shame, and the only method he would accept was conquest. Yet, unlike the rash Cornelius Fuscus or the distracted Domitian, Trajan was a man of profound, almost cold-blooded patience. He would not be lured into a mountain trap. He would not underestimate his shrewd and dangerous opponent. He would, instead, prepare. The first 3 years of his reign, from 98 to 101 AD, were a masterclass in meticulous, overwhelming preparation for total war. One of his very first acts as emperor was not to go to Rome to receive the Senate's acclamation, but to travel directly to the Danube, to the joint frontiers of Pannonia and Moesia. He spent months on the border, inspecting every fortress, reviewing every legion, and initiating a massive infrastructure program. He understood that a war against Decebalus would be a war of logistics, a war of supply. The army could not be ambushed if it built its own secure roads. The most famous of these projects was the road he had carved into the sheer, rocky cliffs of the Danube's iron gates, a narrow gorge where the river flowed fast and dangerously. Here, his engineers, in a feat that still defies belief, chiseled a pathway directly out of the mountainside, supported in places by massive timber beams set into the rock. A marble plaque, the Tabula Traiana, was carved into the cliff to commemorate the feat, its inscription thanking the emperor for making a road by cutting the mountain. This was not a road for commerce. It was a highway for legions, a permanent bypass that would allow his heavy supply barges to be towed past the impassable rapids, ensuring his invasion force would never, ever starve. While his engineers tamed the river, Trajan assembled his army. This would not be a mere border patrol, nor the 4 or 5 legions of Fuscus's doomed expedition. Trajan called upon the veteran legions from across the entire empire, pulling battle-hardened units from Germania, from Britain, and from the Syrian east. He mustered a force of staggering size, 12, perhaps even 15 legions. When one includes the vast specialized cohorts of auxiliaries, the archers from Crete, the cavalry from Numidia, the slingers from the Balearic Islands, the total invasion force numbered well over 100,000 men, and perhaps as many as 150,000. It was one of the largest single armies the Roman Empire had ever put into the field, a hammer of almost unimaginable weight, and it was all being gathered for the express purpose of crushing a single kingdom. He also established a new, heavily fortified legionary base at the city of Viminacium in Moesia Superior, a perfect staging ground for the invasion. New forts were built, old ones were strengthened, and the entire southern bank of the Danube was transformed into a single, massive military machine, a springboard for the coming leap. In Rome, the mints worked overtime, striking new coins to pay the soldiers, coins that already bore the images of victory and imperial confidence. Trajan had secured the full backing of the Senate, which he treated with a respect Domitian never had, framing the coming conflict not as a war of choice, but of dire necessity, a bellum justum, a just war to punish a treacherous king and restore Roman honor. By the spring of 101 AD, the preparations were complete. The subsidies to Decebalus had no doubt been stopped. The roads were finished, the granaries were full, the legions were mustered. The great, patient, and meticulous emperor, his ambition finally ready to be unleashed, stood at the head of his army and looked north, across the great river, to the mountain kingdom whose time, he had decided, had finally run out. The vast veteran army of the Roman Empire was now gathered on the south bank of the great river, a sprawling city of leather, wool, and steel, all animated by the singular, patient will of the Emperor Trajan. The new roads, like the one carved into the cliffs of the iron gates, had secured the supply lines, and the granaries were full. But for an invasion of this magnitude, for a war that Trajan envisioned not as a punitive raid, but as a final, decisive conquest, one last piece of logistical genius was required. Pontoon bridges, the floating causeways of armies in a hurry, were vulnerable. They could be burned by enemy fire ships, and most critically, they could be shattered by the massive ice flows that the Danube, the Donaris, hurled downriver in the spring thaw or the sudden winter freeze. A temporary bridge was a lifeline that could be cut. Trajan, in his meticulous ambition, did not want a lifeline. He wanted a highway. He wanted a permanent, all-weather, undeniable expression of Roman power, a structure that would chain the barbarian North Bank to the civilized South forever. To achieve this impossible feat, he summoned the greatest architect and military engineer of the age, a man whose genius was as profound in its own way as Trajan's was in matters of state. His name was Apollodorus of Damascus, a Syrian-Greek master builder who had already proven his skill in designing and constructing forts and war machines. To him, Trajan gave a simple, staggering directive. Build a bridge across the lower Danube, the widest and most turbulent river in the known world, and build it to last. Apollodorus, a man who saw in the problems of physics and hydrology only a set of equations to be solved, set to work. He chose a spot near the Roman fortress of Burebista, where the river was, if not narrow, at least manageable, a span of just over a kilometer, or about 3,700 feet. What he designed and what his legions and engineers proceeded to build over the course of just 2 years remains one of the supreme engineering achievements of all human history. The true challenge was not the span itself, it was the foundation. One could not simply build on the mud of the riverbed. Apollodorus had to anchor his bridge to the very rock of the earth in the middle of a deep, powerful, and relentless current. To do this, he employed a technology of breathtaking scale. His men constructed 20 massive, hollow timber frames on the riverbank, structures we now call caissons. Each one was a colossal, watertight wooden box, perhaps 60 feet square. These were then floated out one by one to the precise surveyed locations in the river, and then, with immense coordinated effort, they were sunk, filled with stone, until they settled firmly on the riverbed. Once a caisson was in place, the water inside its hollow core was bailed out, a frantic, ceaseless task for thousands of men, working in relays with buckets and Archimedes screws, the leather buckets rising and falling in a constant rhythmic blur. This left them with a dry, protected workspace below the level of the river. Inside this wooden womb, Roman builders, their work lit by the smoky glow of oil lamps, laid the foundations, and then began to build the pier itself, using the incredible Roman concrete, opus cementicum, a mixture of lime, volcanic ash, pozzolana, and rubble, a material that would harden to a strength greater than the stone around it. One by one, 20 of these colossal masonry piers rose from the swirling, angry water. They were massive, wedge-shaped structures, their prows pointing upstream to break the force of the current and the winter ice. Upon these unshakable foundations, Apollodorus's engineers then raised the superstructure. This was not a flat, stone road, but a series of gigantic, soaring segmental arches made of timber. Entire forests were felled to provide the millions of board feet of oak and larch required for these intricate load-bearing trusses. It was a bridge of hybrid design, its feet made of eternal stone and concrete, its shoulders and spine made of wood, giving it a flexibility and strength that a purely stone-arched bridge of this length might have lacked. At each end, it was anchored to the land by monumental, multi-storied castra, or gateway fortresses, their towers guarding the entrance to this Roman highway. When it was finished, it was the longest bridge in the world, and would remain so for over 1,000 years. It was 19 meters wide, more than enough for 2 legionary columns to march abreast, side by side with their rattling supply carts. This was the final, devastating piece of Trajan's meticulous preparation. It was a symbol, a statement in stone and wood that was as loud and clear as any declaration of war. It told Decebalus, in his mountain capital, that the Danube, the god river that had protected his people for 1,000 years, was no longer a border. It was just another Roman road. The bridge was a logistical and psychological dagger, built with Roman concrete and Syrian genius, aimed directly at the heart of the Dacian kingdom. Today, on the banks of the Danube at Drobeta Turnu Severin in Romania and at Kladovo in Serbia, the ruins of Apollodorus's work can still be seen. When the river is low, the square, defiant stumps of the first 2 piers emerge from the water, a 2,000-year-old echo of the moment the empire decided to reach across the water and never, ever let go. With the monumental bridge at Drobeta now anchoring his power to the northern bank, the Emperor Trajan, in the spring of 101 AD, finally gave the order to advance. This was not the rash, headlong charge of Cornelius Fuscus. It was the slow, inexorable, and terrifyingly methodical surge of a tidal wave. The legions, a river of steel and red-dyed wool, flowed across Apollodorus's bridge, their hobnailed sandals echoing on the massive timber roadway, their standards and eagles glittering in the spring sunlight. Over 100,000 men, a force of almost unimaginable scale, began to push deep into the Dacian heartland, their advance secured by the constant, parallel movement of the supply flotillas on the Danube. Trajan, a general who left nothing to chance, had learned the fatal lesson of his predecessor. He would not be ambushed in a single, narrow valley. He split his massive army into 2 main columns, each a self-sufficient fighting force, their movements coordinated as they advanced on separate, parallel routes, a great 2-pronged pincer movement, designed to cut off and envelop any Dacian force that dared to meet them in the field. Decebalus, a master of his own terrain, was not idle. He knew he could not stop the legions on the flat, open plains near the Danube. The Roman heavy infantry was supreme in that environment. His strategy, as it had been before, was to draw them into his own territory, into the winding forested valleys and narrow passes of the Carpathians, where the falx and the wolf-pack ambush could negate the Roman advantage of discipline and numbers. He fell back slowly, his cavalry skirmishing, his scouts watching, forcing the Romans to fight for every mile, all while leading them toward the one place he had prepared to make his stand. He led them back to the dreadful, familiar ground of Tapai, the iron gates of Transylvania, the very pass where he had annihilated the army of Fuscus over a decade before. It was a statement of defiance, a psychological challenge to the new emperor. Decebalus was, in effect, daring Trajan to walk into the same grave. But Trajan, as we know, was not Fuscus. He arrived at Tapai not with a vulnerable, strung-out column, but with a prepared, methodical, and overwhelmingly powerful assault force. He knew the heights would be fortified, and he knew the Falks would be waiting in the trees. The Second Battle of Tapai, fought in 101 AD, was not a swift ambush. It was a brutal, grinding, and desperate slogging match. Before the main assault, Trajan sent his auxiliary cohorts, the specialized mountain troops and light infantry, to scale the steep, wooded slopes on either side of the pass, a bitter tree-by-tree fight, to clear the Dacian skirmishers and archers from the high ground. Only when his flanks were secure did he commit the heavy legions to the main assault up the valley floor, their shields locked into the famous testudo formation to protect them from the rain of arrows and stones from above. The Dacians, fighting for their homeland, met them with a fury that stunned even the veteran Roman troops. The Falx, as it had before, proved its horrifying worth, its hooked blade pulling shields away, its heavy two-handed swing cleaving through the newly reinforced Roman helmets. The battle, as depicted in the swirling, detailed reliefs of Trajan's column, was a desperate affair. The Roman historian Cassius Dio even records that a violent thunderstorm broke over the battlefield in the midst of the fighting. The Dacians, seeing the lightning, hesitated, perhaps taking it as an ill omen from their sky god, Gebelesis, while the Romans, seeing it as the favor of Jupiter, pressed their attack with renewed vigor. Whether a divine sign or a simple meteorological event, the Roman assault was relentless. The discipline of the legions, their ability to take horrifying casualties, replace the front line, and continue pushing forward, was the deciding factor. After a long, bloody day, the Dacian line, though it had inflicted terrible losses, finally broke. This was the brutal, hard-fought campaign in its entirety. It was not a single, decisive battle, but a series of them, with Tapai as the centerpiece. Decebalus, defeated but not destroyed, once again proved his strategic brilliance. He executed a masterful, fighting retreat, falling back from Tapai deeper into the Orashtie Mountains toward his ultimate stronghold. As he retreated, he waged a scorched earth campaign, his warriors felling trees to block the roads, poisoning wells, and burning their own villages and granaries, determined to leave nothing for the Roman supply train. Trajan, cautious as ever, followed. His legions pushed Decebalus back, step by bloody step, until the Romans finally stood before the first of the great mountain fortresses, perhaps Kostest Setetsui. Here Trajan paused. He could see with his own eyes the power of these new walls, the Murus Dacicus perfected by his own engineers. Winter was approaching. The passes would soon be choked with snow, and a siege against such a formidable, well-provisioned network of citadels, with a defiant and brilliant enemy still at large, was a risk he was not willing to take. He had won the battle, but he had not yet won the war. He had proven Roman arms superior, and he had pushed the Dacian king to the very door of his fortress, but he knew the final assault would require even more. For now he had done enough. He had avenged the defeat of Fuscus, and he was in a position to dictate terms that would, he hoped, permanently cripple the Dacian kingdom. The first great Dacian war was over, but the conquest was incomplete. Trajan, the ever-pragmatic general, stood at the precipice of the Orestiae fortress network. the howling winds of a Carpathian winter beginning to sweep down from the high passes. He had won a costly victory at Tapai. He had pushed the Dacian king to his very doorstep, but he was not a gambler. He knew what a winter siege in these formidable, unknown mountains would cost, and he knew his supply lines, though robust, would be strained to the breaking point by snow and ice. His enemy, Decebalus, was cornered, his field army battered, but he was not broken. He remained secure behind the Murus Dacius walls that Roman engineers had, in a bitter twist of irony, helped to perfect. Both kings, the shrewd Dacian and the methodical Roman, were realists. They knew this round had come to an end, and so, from the walls of his mountain capital, Decebalus sent ambassadors to the Roman camp to sue for peace. The terms that Trajan imposed in 102 AD were not a negotiation. They were a victor's decree, designed to systematically dismantle the very foundations of Dacian power and independence. Decebalus, in a calculated act of survival, was forced to accept them. First, and most symbolically, he was to surrender all the weapons, siege engines, and war machines that he had received from or built with the help of Domitian's engineers. The ballistae and catapultae that now sat on his fortress walls were to be handed over. Second, he was to surrender every Roman engineer, artisan, and most painfully, every Roman deserter who had fled the legions to take service with the Dacian king, seeking higher pay or freedom. Third, and most cripplingly, he was to raze his walls, to tear down the fortifications of his entire mountain stronghold system, including the sacred capital of Sarmizegetusa Regia. He was, in effect, being ordered to strip naked and lay down his only shield. Financially and politically, the terms were just as severe. He was to forfeit any territory his tribes had seized south of the Danube. His foreign policy was to be dissolved. He was forbidden from making alliances or waging war without the express permission of the Roman Senate. He was, in short, to become a rex amicus, a friend and ally of Rome, a standard piece of Roman diplomatic fiction that meant he was now a client king, a vassal, his sovereignty erased. And to ensure these humiliating terms were met, a permanent Roman garrison, a vexillatio or detachment from the legions, would be stationed inside Sarmizegetusa Regia itself, a constant watchful eye in the very heart of the Dacian kingdom. To finalize this submission, Decebalus himself, the man who had defeated an emperor, had to perform the ultimate act of supplication. As depicted on Trajan's column in Rome, the proud king, accompanied by his Terabastes nobility, traveled to the Roman camp and prostrated himself on the ground before the emperor, his hands outstretched, begging for pardon. Trajan, his honor satisfied, returned to Rome. In 103 AD, he celebrated a magnificent triumph, the streets of the capital echoing with the cheers of a populace thrilled by this victory over their most notorious enemy. He was granted the honorific title Dacicus, Conqueror of Dacia, a name that would be stamped on his coins and carved into his monuments forever. The shame of Domitian, he believed, was erased. But Trajan had subdued Decebalus. He had not, it seems, truly understood him. For Decebalus, this peace was not a surrender. It was a ceasefire. It was a humiliating, bitter, but necessary pause to buy time, a strategic retreat to gather strength for the real war. The one he now knew was a struggle not for victory, but for existence. And so, almost immediately, the brief, tense peace became a web of Dacian conspiracy. Quietly, in the dead of night, hidden from the eyes of the small Roman garrison, the Murus Daciacus walls began to rise again. In the deep, secret forges of the mountains, blacksmiths began to hammer out new falx blades. Decebalus, a man now driven by a cold, desperate fury, began to rearm, to retrain his warriors, to stockpile grain in hidden underground silos. But his most dangerous move was diplomatic. He knew, after the brutal lesson of Tapai, that he could not face the full might of Rome alone. He sent secret ambassadors, traveling by hidden routes, on a mission of immense, world-changing importance. He sent them east to the other great power in the world, the only state that Rome truly feared as an equal, the Parthian Empire, ruled by King Pacorus II. The message Decebalus sent was a simple, desperate plea. He proposed a grand alliance, a coordinated two-front war, urging the Parthians to strike Rome in Syria and Mesopotamia, while he, Decebalus, set the entire Danube frontier ablaze. It was the ultimate gamble. He was, in essence, trying to light a world war, the only fire he thought was large enough to burn the Roman threat away for good. The peace was a charade, and the clock was ticking down to a final, inevitable confrontation. The brief, tense peace was in reality a gathering storm. Decebalus, with the cold desperation of a cornered animal, had miscalculated. He had assumed that his secret diplomacy, his quiet rearming, his nocturnal reconstruction of the raised walls would go unnoticed by an emperor celebrating a triumph hundreds of miles away in Rome. But Trajan's empire was not just a machine of conquest, it was a machine of information. Spies, disgruntled Terabastes nobles, captured messengers, or perhaps Roman deserters, who were in fact double agents, eventually brought the truth to the emperor's ear. The news was not just of a broken treaty, it was of a grand, existential conspiracy. The Dacian king was not just rebuilding his forts, he was actively soliciting the Parthian Empire, Rome's mortal enemy in the east, for a coordinated two-front war. For Trajan, this was the ultimate casus belli. This was not a mere broken promise. It was a profound and active betrayal, an act that transformed Decebalus from a defeated vassal, a rex amicus, into a hostess, an enemy of the Roman state and people, a cancer that could not be managed but must be excised. The Senate was informed, and this time, the declaration of war was not for honor or revenge. It was for the debillatio of Dacia, the total extinguishment of its kingdom, its people, and its name. The final invasion was set in motion, and it would be a war not of subjugation, but of annihilation. In 105 AD, Trajan returned to the Danube, and this time there was no patience in his eyes, only a cold, grim finality. Decebalus, knowing his treachery was exposed, did not wait to be attacked. In a final ferocious display of his strategic audacity, he launched a preemptive strike, a desperate gamble to throw the Roman war machine off balance before it could cross the river in force. He unleashed his armies in a massive assault south of the Danube, attacking the Roman forts in Moesia that had been left to guard the frontier. This was no mere raid. It was a full-scale offensive, a last attempt to disrupt the Roman supply lines and legionary staging grounds. For a moment, the frontier buckled under the fury of the falx-wielding assault. But Trajan was already there. The legions, massed and prepared, met the Dacian offensive, and after a series of brutal, bloody battles, hurled them back. The gamble had failed, and in doing so, it had spent the last of Decebalus's offensive strength. Now it was Trajan's turn. The advance, when it came, was not the two-pronged pincer of 101 AD. It was a deluge. Trajan unleashed his legions in a multi-pronged assault, a great closing net designed to envelop the entire Oreste mountain complex from every conceivable direction. He sent columns marching from every point of the compass. One column advanced from the west, up the valley of the Muris River. Another came from the east, marching from Moesia Inferior. A third, led by the emperor himself, took the now familiar central route, across Apollodorus's great bridge at Drobeta and straight toward the dread pass of Tapai. But this time, Tapai was not the goal. It was simply an obstacle to be bypassed. Trajan, having learned the terrain, dispatched his most mobile and hardened auxiliary cohorts, Syrian archers, Batavian infantrymen, Moorish cavalry, on wide flanking maneuvers, guided by local tribesmen who had been bought or coerced into Roman service. This was a new, terrifying kind of war. It was not a war of set-piece battles, but a systematic, strangling siege of an entire country. As the Roman columns advanced, they did not just seek the Dacian army, they sought to erase the land that supported it. This was the debillatio. Villages were burned, not as an afterthought, but as a primary objective. Granaries were seized or torched. Herds of cattle were driven off, and any commodity farmers found in the fields were captured and enslaved. The Roman army was meticulously, methodically, and mercilessly cutting the roots of the Dacian kingdom, ensuring that the warriors hiding in the forests would have no food, no shelter, and no population to return to. The howling of the Draco standard was met now not by the clash of a single line, but by a suffocating silence, the smoke of 1,000 burning hamlets, and the steady, inexorable tramp of hobnailed boots closing in from all sides. The great mountain fortress system, Decebalus's masterpiece of engineering, was now his prison. Trajan's legions did not just march to the front gate. They used their new, intimate knowledge of the terrain to find the high, hidden shepherd's paths. Roman exploratores, or scouts, appeared on the ridges above the fortresses, cutting the lines of communication between them. The 6 citadels, Kostest, Blidaru, Pietraroshi, and the others, were isolated one by one. They were no longer an interlocking defensive web. They were 6 islands, cut off from each other and from their capital, each one now facing its own private and hopeless siege. The Roman war machine, with its ballistae and its towering siege engines, was now being brought up the same mountain roads the Dacian kings had built. The wolf had been hunted, his pack scattered, and his lair surrounded. All that remained was the final, agonizing assault on the heart, the sacred royal capital, Sarmizegetusa Regia. The great interlocking web of fortresses was now just a series of isolated, dying embers. The Roman war machine, advancing with a grim, multi-pronged finality, had systematically severed the connections between the citadels, strangling them one by one. The lesser forts of Kostest, Blidaru, and Pietraroshi, each a formidable masterpiece of Murus Dacicus engineering, had been stormed, starved, or simply bypassed, their garrisons put to the sword or scattered into the unforgiving forests, now filling with Roman patrols. All the outer defenses had fallen, and the Roman columns, their flanks secure, now converged on the final prize, the very heart of the Dacian wolf, the royal and sacred capital, Sarmizegetusa Regia, perched high on its mountain throne. This was not just a fortress. It was the symbolic and spiritual center of the Dacian people, the home of their god and their king. And it was here that Decebalus, his field army shattered, his kingdom burning behind him, had retreated for his final, hopeless stand. Trajan, now in personal command of the encircling forces, was a man of cold, methodical patience. He would not waste the lives of his legionaries in a rash, frontal assault against walls he knew were formidable. This would be a siege, a classic textbook Roman obsidio, a slow, suffocating, and scientific application of pressure, a war of engineering, not of heroic charges. The legionaries, their swords and spears set aside, now took up the dolabra, the military pickaxe, the shovel, and the saw, a vast, suffocating ring of Roman fortifications. A line of circumvallation began to rise, encircling the entire mountain peak. Earthen ramparts were dug, crowned with palisades, and linked by wooden towers, their ballistae and scorpiones, the heavy artillery of the legions, now aimed at the walls that Roman engineers might once have helped to build. The message was clear. Nothing was getting in, and no one, not even the king, was getting out. Inside those walls, the mood must have been one of stoic, terrifying despair. The capital was swelled with refugees, the Burebistas nobles who had fled their burning villas, and the remnants of the Dacian army, all now trapped with their king. But Decebalus was not yet beaten. The city, as his Roman-taught engineers had planned, was well provisioned. The secret underground granaries were full, and the cisterns held water. The defenders, fighting now with the primal fury of those defending their last patch of earth, rained arrows, stones, and javelins down on the Roman work crews below, their phalanx-wielding shock troops launching desperate, suicidal sallies from the gates, trying to burn the Roman siege engines before they could be completed. But for every Roman soldier who fell, 10 more stepped forward to take his place. For every siege tower burned, 2 more were being constructed just out of bowshot. The key to the fortress, as is so often the case, was not its wall, it was its water. The cisterns within Sarmizegathusa were large, but they were finite, designed to supplement the city's primary water source, a brilliant, hidden aqueduct. This aqueduct, a marvel of Dacian engineering, consisted of thousands of interlocking, carefully sealed terracotta pipes, buried deep underground, snaking for miles through the mountains to tap a remote high-altitude spring, delivering a constant secret flow of fresh, cold water into the heart of the capital. It was this hidden artery that kept the city alive, and the Romans, whether through the brutal interrogation of captured Dacians, the betrayal of a deserter, or simply the methodical, relentless scouting of their engineers, found it. The scene, depicted with stark drama on Trajan's column, is one of the pivotal moments of the war. We see the Roman legionaries, their armor stripped off for the hard labor, wielding pickaxes and shovels, having unearthed the line of terracotta pipes. We see them methodically smashing each pipe, one by one, severing the city's lifeline. The effect inside the walls must have been immediate and catastrophic. The flow of fresh water dwindled and then stopped. The capital was now reduced to its stagnant cisterns, a supply that, with thousands of refugees and soldiers to provide for, would last only days. Thirst, that most insidious and demoralizing of enemies, now joined the Roman legions outside the gates. The end, when it came, was an apocalypse of fire and steel. With the defenders weakened by thirst and their morale broken, Trajan gave the order for the final assault. Roman battering rams, great iron-tipped beams sheltered under mobile sheds called testudines, were rolled up to the gates, their rhythmic or pounding blows shaking the very foundations of the Murus Dacicus. Siege towers, bristling with archers and crowned with drawbridges, were pushed against the stone facings. From all sides, the legionaries advanced, their shields locked above their heads in the testudo formation, a slow, unstoppable armored reptile crawling toward the base of the walls. The Dacian defense, even in this last hopeless moment, was ferocious. They poured boiling oil, pitch, and massive stones down on the attackers. But the walls, finally, were breached. The Roman legionaries, their gladi drawn, poured into the capital, and the methodical siege gave way to a chaotic, brutal street-by-street slaughter. The remaining Terrabastes nobles, seeing that all was lost, gathered for one last defiant act. They had a choice: capture, humiliation, and slavery in a Roman triumph, or the immortality promised by Zalmoxis. As depicted on the column, they gathered in the sacred precinct, mixed a great bowl of poison, likely hemlock, and one by one they drank it, choosing to die as free men on their own holy ground. At the same moment, the city itself was put to the torch. The Roman soldiers, in their vengeful fury, set fire to the thatched roofs of the workshops, the great columned halls of the temples, and the royal palace itself. Sarmizegetusa Regia, the sacred mountain capital of Dacia, the heart of its faith and its power for over a century, was consumed in a pillar of fire and smoke that must have been visible for 100 miles, a vast funeral pyre signaling the death of a nation. The great capital of Sarmizegetusa Regia was a smoking, poisoned ruin, its sacred fires extinguished by Roman steel, and its last noble defenders dead by their own hands in the ashes of their temples. The heart of the Dacian kingdom had ceased to beat, but a kingdom, even one so thoroughly shattered, is not just a place. It is an idea, and as long as the king, the living symbol of that idea, remained free, the war was not truly over. Trajan, a man who left no embers to rekindle a flame, knew this. Decebalus, in the final chaotic moments of the capital's fall, had not been among the nobles who drank the poison, nor was his body found among the slain. With a small, loyal bodyguard of his most elite Terrabastes, the king, a master of his own mountain wilderness, had slipped through a gap in the Roman circumvallation, perhaps through a hidden sally port, or down a treacherous, unguarded goat path under the cover of the smoke and the screams, and had vanished into the vast, primeval forests of the Carpathians. He was now a fugitive, a king without a kingdom, a wolf without a pack, but he was still alive, and in that life, the spirit of Dacian resistance endured. For Trajan, the capture of Decebalus became the single, final objective of the entire war. The legions were unleashed not to conquer territory, which they had already done, but to hunt a single man. The emperor dispatched his most elite, mobile units, the exploratores, the scouts, and the light auxiliary cavalry, particularly the famed Moorish and Pannonian equities, with one simple command: find him. A massive, kingdom-wide manhunt began, a desperate chase through the rugged, labyrinthine terrain that had for so long been Dacia's greatest defense. Roman gold was offered to any tribesman who would betray his king's location, and the penalty for aiding him was undoubtedly instant and total annihilation. The Roman cavalry, relentless and methodical, spread out, following every rumor, every cold campfire, every footprint in the mud of a riverbank. Decebalus, for his part, was not simply fleeing to save his own life. He was, in all likelihood, making a desperate final strategic dash. His goal was probably to break out of the Roman encirclement, to flee east, perhaps to his Scythian or Roxolani allies on the Great Plains, or in a last hopeless gamble, to make his way to the Parthian Empire, the great enemy he had tried to enlist, to offer his services as a general and a symbol of anti-Roman defiance. He and his small band of followers rode hard, their horses exhausted, their fine cap-wearers' robes now torn and stained, moving by night, hiding in caves and dense thickets by day, the land of their ancestors now a foreign, hostile territory filled with Roman patrols. But the Roman net was too fine, their pursuit too relentless. The noose, which had begun as a ring around an entire nation, was now tightening around a single wooded valley. The final tragic scene is immortalized, not in the texts of historians, but in the spiraling visual narrative of Trajan's column. It is a moment of profound cinematic power. A small unit of Roman auxiliary cavalry, their lances poised, their cloaks flying, has finally cornered the king and his last few companions. The Dacians are dismounted, their horses perhaps having given out. A brief, desperate, final skirmish has taken place. The last of the king's Terabastes lie dead or dying at his feet. Decebalus himself, his royal authority now reduced to the defiant set of his jaw, is shown slumped against the trunk of a great oak tree, wounded, his strength failing. A Roman cavalryman, his name preserved for all time on his own funeral steles found decades later, Tiberius Claudius Maximus, leaps from his horse, his sword drawn, his arm outstretched, determined to take the grand prize, to capture the king alive and present him in chains for Trajan's magnificent triumph. But Decebalus, the man who had humbled an emperor and defied an empire, had one final choice, one last move in the great game. He would not be paraded. He would not be a spectacle for the Roman mob, a chained barbarian king walking before his conqueror's chariot, destined to be ritually strangled in the Tullianum prison. He would not give Trajan that satisfaction. As Tiberius Claudius Maximus surged forward, the king, with the last of his strength, did not beg for mercy or attempt to fight. He took his own seca, the iconic curved Dacian dagger, the weapon of his people, and in a single fluid, defiant motion, he drew it across his own throat. It was the last autonomous act of a sovereign king, a choice not of suicide, but of self-determination. He was not being killed by Rome. He was departing, as his faith in Zalmoxis had always taught him, to a place where the legions could not follow. Tiberius Claudius Maximus, arriving a fraction of a second too late, found only a dying man. His orders, however, were clear. He could not bring the king back alive, but he would bring back the proof of his death. He severed the head of the fallen king. This grisly trophy, the head of Decebalus, was brought back to Trajan's field headquarters. The emperor, seeing the lifeless face of his great, brilliant, and defiant rival, finally knew with absolute certainty that the war was over. The resistance had no more a head, no more a heart. The head was packed and sent to Rome, where it was thrown onto the Gemonian stairs, the place of ultimate humiliation, for the populace to see before being perhaps tossed into the Tiber. But the act itself, that final desperate choice under the tree, had, in its own tragic way, granted Decebalus the very thing he sought. He had denied Rome its total victory, and in choosing his own end, he had secured his own defiant immortality. The death of the king, that final defiant act of self-immolation under the oak tree, was the true and final end of the Dacian Wars. The severed head of Decebalus, displayed first to Trajan and then to the morbid crowds in Rome, was the ultimate symbol that the resistance, as an organized and spirited force, was over. The scattered bands of falx-wielding warriors who still lurked in the deep forests were now just latrones, or bandits, leaderless and hunted, a problem for military police, not a strategic threat to the legions. Trajan, his great and terrible work now complete, returned to Rome not just as a triumphant general, but as the architect of a new Roman order. In 106 AD, the Roman Senate formally and with great ceremony declared the annexation of the conquered lands. The kingdom of Dacia, the ancient home of the Getae and the wolves, was officially erased from the map, and in its place, a new imperial province was born, Dacia Felix, or Fortunate Dacia. This name, Fortunate, was, of course, a declaration from the Roman perspective, and for Rome, it was fortunate indeed. The immediate spoils of the war, as Cassius Dio would later claim in his famously exaggerated figures, were beyond the dreams of avarice. Millions of pounds of gold and silver, the vast accumulated treasure of the Dacian kings, were discovered, likely betrayed to the Romans by a Dacian noble, and carted south, a river of wealth so immense that it funded the emperor's grandiose building projects for years to come, including his colossal new forum and the magnificent 126-foot-tall marble column that would narrate this very story. But the true prize was not the hoard, it was the mine. The Apuseni Mountains, the Golden Quadrilateral, was immediately declared ager publicus, the personal property of the emperor, its output now flowing directly into the imperial treasury. But to secure this prize, Trajan knew that simple occupation was not enough. The land was too wild, its people too fierce, their memory of independence too recent. The war had been a debillatio, an extinguishment, and the peace that followed would be one of replacement. What followed was one of the most brutal and systematic acts of social engineering in the entire Roman period. The war itself had been catastrophic for the Dacian people. Tens, perhaps hundreds, of thousands of warriors had been killed in the fighting. A vast number of the commati had been captured and sold into slavery. The slave markets of the East were flooded with Dacians, their strong frames and fierce reputation making them valuable, if dangerous, property. Still others, the free Dacians, had fled, gathering in the unconquered lands to the north and east, in what is now Moldova and the Ukraine, where they would remain a barbarian thorn in Rome's side for centuries, a constant nagging reminder of what had been lost. The result of this war, this flight and this enslavement, was a profound depopulation of the new province. Dacia Felix was, in many ways, an empty, silent, and haunted land. And into this vacuum, Trajan unleashed a new kind of invasion, a wave of colonization. The 4th century historian Eutropius, summarizing the event, wrote that Trajan brought ex toto orbe Romano from all over the Roman world, a vast multitude of men to inhabit the fields and the cities. This was a deliberate, state-sponsored policy of repopulation. The new province was not to be a Dacian land governed by Romans. It was to be a new Roman land, built atop the ruins of the old. The first and most important of these colonists were the soldiers themselves, the veterans of the legions that had fought the war. Men from Spain, from Gaul, from Syria were given their discharge, a plot of fertile Dacian land, and a generous pension, incentivized to settle, marry local women, those who remained, and raise their sons as Roman citizens. Entire legions, such as Legio Gemina and Legio Scythic Macedonica, were permanently stationed in the new province, and their great legionary castra, or fortresses, at places like Apulum, modern Alba Iulia, and Potesa, modern Turda, became the nuclei of new, thriving Roman cities, the Canabae, or civilian settlements, outside their walls growing into bustling commercial centers. But it was not just soldiers. The promise of gold, the Dacian gold rush, drew specialists from every corner of the empire. Miners from Dalmatia and Noricum, men with generations of expertise in hard rock mining, were brought in to run the imperial gold mines at Alburnus Mayer on an industrial, efficient, and brutal scale, their lives and legal contracts preserved for us on wax tablets found in their abandoned galleries. Merchants from the eastern provinces, Syrians and Greeks, arrived to set up shop, their inscriptions thanking their exotic gods found in the ruins of the new towns. Farmers, ranchers, and artisans from across the Danube in Moesia and Pannonia were offered land, seeking new opportunities on a freshly conquered frontier. And to house this new, imported population, the Romans did what they did best. They built. The ultimate symbolic act was the founding of the new provincial capital. They did not rebuild Decebalus's high mountain fortress. Sarmizegethusa Regia was left to the wolves and the ghosts, a razed and forbidden place. Instead, down on the flat, open plain, some 40 kilometers away, Trajan's architects laid out a new, perfect Roman city. Colonia Ulpia Traiana Augusta Dacica Sarmizegethusa. It was a city of classical order, its streets laid out in a perfect cardo and decumanus grid, its heart a magnificent forum, its stones quarried from the ruins of the old Dacian sanctuaries. It boasted an amphitheater for gladiatorial games, temples to Jupiter and the imperial cult, public baths, and elegant villas with mosaic floors. It was Rome, in miniature, planted in the heart of a conquered land, a defiant statement of permanence. A network of paved Roman roads soon connected this new capital to the Danube and to the other new cities and forts, like Poralisum, that sprang up to guard the new northernmost frontier of the empire. Dacia had been fortunate indeed. For Rome, it was a new, rich, and now thoroughly Roman land. And so, the land of the wolf was tamed, or so it seemed. For the next 165 years, Dacia Felix was a thriving, if turbulent, part of the Roman Empire. The gold mines of Alburnus Mayer poured their steady, glittering stream into the imperial treasury. The new cities, like Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegethusa, flourished, their amphitheaters echoing with the clash of gladiatorial steel, their forums bustling with merchants from Syria and veterans from Spain. The Latin language, the tongue of the soldiers, the administrators, and the colonists took root in the fertile soil, a new, dominant sound that began to overlay the ancient, lost Thracian dialect of the Dacians. The Comati who had survived, those who had not been enslaved or had not fled, slowly began to assimilate. They took Roman names, they adopted Roman customs, and most importantly, they learned to speak the vulgar Latin of the legionaries and the miners. A new hybrid culture was being born, the Daco-Roman. But the Roman peace was never absolute. The empire, in conquering Decebalus's kingdom, had not conquered all the Dacians. The free Dacians, the tribes like the Costoboci and the Carpi, who had lived outside the borders of the kingdom, remained a constant, furious presence on the new province's northeastern frontier. They, often in alliance with the ever-restless Roxolani and the newly arriving formidable Goths, never stopped attacking. For them, the Roman province was a stolen land, and for a century and a half, the legions stationed in Dacia were in an almost constant state of low-intensity border warfare, punctuated by brutal, large-scale invasions. The province, though rich, was a fortress, a salient pushed deep into barbaricum, expensive to hold and difficult to defend. By the middle of the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire itself was convulsing in the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of plague, civil war, and economic collapse, its frontiers buckling everywhere. The pressure on Dacia from the Goths and the Carpi became unbearable. The province, once a symbol of Trajan's power, was now a dangerous liability. Around the year 271 AD, the Emperor Aurelian, a pragmatic and brilliant soldier emperor, made a hard strategic choice. He ordered the full Roman withdrawal from Dacia Felix. The legions were pulled back, the Roman administration was evacuated, and the Danube, the great river that Apollodorus had bridged, once again became the limes, the fortified border of the empire. The colonists, the vast multi-ethnic population of Latin speakers, were officially abandoned. And it is here, in this moment of imperial retreat, that our story flows into its final, and perhaps its most profound and enduring historiographical mystery. What happened to the Daco-Romans? What became of this Latin-speaking population, now left to the mercy of the Goths and the Huns and the Avars and the Slavs who would sweep over the land in the great chaotic migration of peoples? For centuries, history, as written by the chroniclers of other nations, falls almost silent. The lights seem to go out in Dacia, and when they come back on, nearly 1,000 years later, we find a new people, the Vlachs, or as they call themselves, the Romani, Romanians, speaking a language, Romanian, that is, at its very core, a unique, evolved form of Latin, an island of romance in a sea of Slavic and Hungarian. This is the great debate of Daco-Roman continuity. Did that abandoned Latin-speaking populace die out or flee south? Was the land left empty only to be repopulated centuries later by Vlachs migrating north from the Balkans, as some later historians would argue? Or as the continuity theory holds, did they simply endure? Did they retreat as their ancestors had from the fertile plains and the visible Roman cities, back into the high, sheltering, and defensible forests of the Carpathians? Did they become a people of shepherds and mountain farmers, their Roman towns crumbling, their Latin language slowly evolving in isolation, absorbing Slavic words and Thracian echoes, their memory of Rome reduced to a name, Roman? This mystery is the very heart of a national identity. The truth, as it so often does, likely lies in a gentle, complex blend. The legacy of Dacia is not a simple, linear story, but a cultural fusion. The empire left its language, its laws, and its name. The Dacians, though their language is lost, save for a few dozen words, gave their genetic stock, their knowledge of the land, their intimate connection to the mountains and the forests, and perhaps a certain indomitable lupine spirit. The story concludes not with the sharp, final sound of a gladius or a falx, but with the quiet, persistent echo of survival. The kingdom of Decebalus and the province of Trajan are both long gone, buried under the soil of millennia. But the Daco-Roman people, forged in that brief, violent, and transformative crucible of war and colonization, walked on through the darkness of unrecorded centuries. They carried the memory of both the wolf and the eagle, a quiet, shepherd people, moving with the seasons, waiting in the long shadow of the mountains, a living testament to the idea that history, in the end, belongs not to the great emperors or the defiant kings, but to those who simply, stubbornly, and quietly endure.